A woman in a torn wool coat rides through a blizzard toward the most dangerous ranch in Montana Territory. Inside waits Caleb Mercer, the cattle baron who has humiliated 20 wealthy brides and sworn off love forever. But Clara Bennett isn't here for his money. She's here because she recognizes something in him that terrifies everyone else, the same crushing loneliness that's been killing her slowly for years. Tonight, in the worst storm of the decade, two broken people will either destroy each other or discover that some walls were built to be torn down. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels. The first bride arrived in June of 1883. She came in a carriage that cost more than most men earned in 5 years, wearing a dress the color of champagne and carrying letters of introduction from 3 senators and a railroad magnate. Her father owned half the copper mines in Butte. She stepped onto Caleb Mercer's porch with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire privileged life. She left before dinner crying into her expensive handkerchief, while Caleb watched from his study window with all the emotion of a man observing weather. The second bride came in July, then August, then September. By the time winter locked the Montana mountains in ice, 20 women had made the journey to the Mercer Ranch. 20 women had walked through those massive oak doors expecting to charm, or seduce, or negotiate their way into becoming Mrs. Caleb Mercer. 20 women had left humiliated, furious, or broken. The townspeople in Watershed, the mining settlement 15 miles down the valley, started taking bets on how long each one would last. The record was 4 hours, set by a Boston banker's daughter who actually made it through lunch before Caleb's cold silence drove her back to her carriage. "He's not human," the blacksmith's wife declared in the general store, her voice carrying over the pickle barrels and flour sacks. "No man treats women like that unless something inside him died." "Something did die," old Henry Walsh muttered from his corner by the stove. He'd been working cattle in these mountains since before Montana was a territory. Anyone who remembers Rachel Thornton knows exactly what. The younger folks didn't remember. They only knew the legend. Caleb Mercer, 36 years old, built like he'd been carved from the same granite as the mountains, running the largest cattle operation between Denver and the Canadian border. They knew he could break a man's jaw with one punch, and had done exactly that to 3 ranch hands who tried stealing his stock. They knew he paid fair wages, demanded brutal honesty, and hadn't smiled in front of another human being in over a decade. What they didn't know, what Caleb never spoke about, was the woman who taught him that love was just another form of theft. Rachel Thornton had been beautiful the way mountain storms are beautiful, dangerous, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. She'd grown up in Watershed, daughter of a failed prospector, dreaming of silk dresses and ballrooms while mending her own threadbare skirts. When young Caleb Mercer started building his ranch from nothing, working cattle drives and saving every penny, she'd encouraged him with kisses that tasted like promises. "When you're successful," she'd whispered against his neck during those stolen moments behind her father's cabin, "we'll have everything. A big house, beautiful things, a real life." So Caleb had worked like a man possessed. He bought land when others thought he was crazy. He survived winters that killed stronger men. He built his herd through intelligence and persistence and sheer stubborn refusal to fail. 5 years of breaking himself against the wilderness until finally, he had something to offer her. He'd ridden into town with a ring in his pocket and plans for a house that would make her the envy of the territory. He found her packing to leave for San Francisco with a mining executive twice her age and 3 times Caleb's net worth. "Don't look at me like that," she'd said, not quite meeting his eyes. "You're still just a cowboy, Caleb. I want more than mud and cattle. I want a real life." She took his heart when she left. Caleb buried what remained under work, stone, and deliberate isolation. Now, 13 years later, the ranch had grown into an empire. The house Rachel had wanted sat on a hill overlooking 5,000 acres of prime grazing land. Caleb Mercer was wealthier than the mining executive who'd stolen his future. And none of it meant anything at all. The oak-paneled study where he spent most of his time felt more like a jail than an office. Ledgers and contracts covered his desk. Maps marked every section of his territory. And through the window he could see the barn where he'd once believed in stupid things like happiness. His foreman, Jack Drummond, knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission. That was their arrangement. Jack was the only man on the ranch who'd earned the right to ignore protocol. "Boss!" Jack was 53, weathered by decades of hard winters, and had known Caleb since he was an arrogant kid with more ambition than sense. "We got a problem." Caleb didn't look up from the contract he was reviewing. The fence line? Fixed yesterday. This is different. Jack pulled off his hat, which he only did when news was complicated. Storm's coming. Weather station in Helena says it's going to be the worst we've seen in 20 years, already dumped 3 feet on the northern ranges. Get the cattle down to the lower pastures. Double-check the barn roof. Make sure we've got enough feed stored. Already done. Jack hesitated. There's something else. Woman rode up about an hour ago. Says she needs to see you. Caleb's hand stopped moving across the page. His jaw tightened. No. Boss, I don't care who sent her or what family she's from. The answer is no. Give her money for a hotel in town and send her back before the storm hits. That's the thing. Jack's voice carried a strange note Caleb couldn't identify. She didn't come in a fancy carriage. She came alone on a horse that's half-starved, wearing a coat that's more holes than wool, and she didn't ask to marry you. That made Caleb look up. What did she ask for? To talk. Said she recognized something in you. Everyone recognizes something in me. Usually dollar signs. Not her. Jack met his boss's cold stare without flinching. She's waiting in the kitchen. Maggie gave her coffee. And before you order me to throw her out, you should know the temperature's already dropping. Storm will hit before she makes it halfway to town. Horse won't survive it. Probably she won't either. Caleb stood, his chair scraping against hardwood. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair starting to show silver at the temples, and eyes the color of river ice. Women called him handsome. He called himself functional. I didn't build guest rooms to run a charity house for wanderers. Didn't say you did. Just telling you what's happening. Jack replaced his hat. Your call, boss. Always is. He left Caleb standing in the study, staring at nothing, while wind rattled the windows and the first snow began to fall. Caleb could have stayed in his study, could have sent Jack back with orders to give the woman money and directions to town, could have returned to his ledgers and contracts and the comfortable numbness that had become his entire existence. Instead, he found himself walking toward the kitchen. He told himself it was practical. He needed to see what kind of fool rode into the mountains alone with a storm coming. Needed to assess whether she was actually stupid or just desperate. Information was useful. That's all this was. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, with a cast-iron stove that Maggie kept burning year-round and copper pots hanging from ceiling hooks. Maggie herself, 67 years old, built like a barrel, and the only woman Caleb genuinely respected, stood near the stove with her arms crossed, watching their visitor. The woman sat at the scarred wooden table with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, like she was trying to absorb its warmth directly into her bones. She wasn't what Caleb expected. The previous brides had been polished, perfumed, practiced. This woman looked like she'd been assembled from spare parts and hard choices. Maybe 30 years old, maybe older. Hard to tell with the exhaustion carved into her face. Brown hair pulled back in a bun that was more practical than pretty. A dress that had been mended so many times the original color was debatable. Hands wrapped around that coffee cup showed calluses and old scars. But her eyes were the kind of gray that came before storms. And when she looked up at him, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years. Recognition. Not desire. Not calculation. Just the simple, terrible acknowledgement of one damaged thing seeing another. Mr. Mercer. Her voice was quiet but steady. Not scared, not flirtatious. Just tired. Thank you for seeing me. I haven't decided if I am seeing you. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, deliberately casual. Jack says you need to talk. Talk fast. Storm's coming and you need to be gone before it hits. She stopped, seemed to reconsider, started again. I came because I heard about you, about the women you've turned away. Then you wasted a trip. I'm not interested in whatever version of courtship you're attempting. I'm not here to court you. Something flickered across her face. Not quite amusement, maybe pain. I'm here because 20 women came to this ranch and you rejected every single one before sunset. That's not the behavior of a man who's picky. That's the behavior of a man who's terrified. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Maggie made a small noise that might have been concern or approval. Hard to tell with Maggie. Caleb pushed off the doorframe, his entire body going still the way it did before violence. You know nothing about me. I know you're lonely. The woman stood, leaving her coffee behind, meeting his anger with something worse, understanding. I know you built walls so high that nobody can reach you anymore. I know because I did the same thing. Get out. My name is Clara Bennett. I was married for 7 years to a man who drank himself to death while I pretended everything was fine. I spent so long making myself smaller, quieter, less, that I forgot what my own voice sounded like. She took one step toward him, just one. When he finally died, everyone in town told me I should be relieved. But I wasn't relieved. I was empty. I'd spent so many years surviving that I forgot how to actually live. This is a touching story, Caleb said, his voice like gravel. It has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with you, because I see the same thing in your eyes that I see in mine every morning. You're not angry at those women for coming here. You're angry because they remind you that you're still alive, and being alive means you might still get hurt. Maggie had gone completely silent, which almost never happened. Snow was hitting the windows now, hard enough to hear. Caleb stared at this stranger, who had somehow spoken truth he'd never admitted even to himself. Part of him wanted to grab her by the shoulders and throw her out into the snow. Part of him wanted to ask how she learned to see through people like that. He did neither. "Storm's here," he said flatly. "You can stay tonight. Tomorrow morning, you leave. Jack will make sure your horse is fed and sheltered. Maggie will show you to a guest room." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm not being kind. I'm being practical. Dead women on my property cause legal problems." He turned to leave, then stopped. "And Mrs. Bennett? Whatever you think you see in me, you're wrong. I'm not lonely. I'm content. There's a difference." "If you say so." She said it so gently that it felt like being stabbed. Caleb left before he did something stupid like continue the conversation. He returned to his study, poured 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't drink, and stared at ledgers he couldn't focus on while the storm built itself into a fury outside his windows. In the guest room down the hall, Clara Bennett stood at her own window, watching snow erase the world, and wondered if coming here had been bravery or just another form of running away. Neither of them slept that night. The storm had other plans. By midnight, 3 feet of snow had fallen and showed no signs of stopping. Wind screamed down from the peaks like something alive and angry, battering the ranch house until even the solid oak walls creaked. Temperature dropped so fast that ice formed on the inside of windows. Caleb gave up on sleep around 2 in the morning. He pulled on wool pants and a heavy shirt, padded downstairs in stockinged feet, and found Maggie already in the kitchen, baking bread because that's what Maggie did when she was worried. "Can't sleep either?" she asked without looking up from her dough. "Checking the house. Storm like this, we might lose shingles or shutters." She shaped the dough with practiced efficiency. "Nothing to do with our guest, I'm sure." "It's not. That woman tell you truths you didn't want to hear?" "That woman is leaving in the morning." "In this?" Maggie gestured toward the window, where visibility had shrunk to about 6 inches. "She'll freeze before she reaches the gate. Horse 2. "Not my problem." "No? Whose problem is it then? The person who dies trying to leave your ranch because you're too stubborn to admit you might want company?" Maggie finally looked at him, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "I've worked for you 13 years, Caleb. I've watched you turn this place into a fortress. I've never said a word about it because it was your choice. But that woman sitting upstairs isn't like the others. She's exactly like the others. They all want something. Maybe, but at least she's honest about it." Maggie returned to her bread. "She told me about her husband, about the years she spent pretending, about finally running because staying meant disappearing completely. That's not someone looking for your money, Caleb. That's someone looking for proof that broken people can still build something real." "I'm not broken." "No?" Maggie's voice was softer now. "Then what are you?" Caleb didn't have an answer for that. He was saved from finding one by a crash from upstairs, something heavy hitting the floor, followed by the distinctive sound of a woman swearing. He took the stairs 2 at a time, Maggie right behind him. The guest room door was open. Inside, Clara Bennett stood in a nightgown that had seen better decades, holding a fireplace poker, staring at the window where a shutter had torn loose and smashed through the glass. Snow was already pouring in. "I tried to catch it," she said, slightly breathless. "Clearly, I failed." Wind howled through the broken window, dropping the room temperature by the second. Caleb moved fast. He grabbed blankets from the bed, stuffed them into the window frame to block the immediate assault, then turned to Clara. "You hurt?" "Just my pride." "Maggie, get her downstairs. I'll board this up." "In the middle of the night? In this storm? Would you prefer I do it in the morning when the entire room is buried in snow?" He was already moving toward the door. Jack keeps boards and nails in the barn. I'll be back in 20 minutes. Caleb, Maggie started, but he was gone. Clara stood in her inadequate nightgown, holding a fireplace poker like a weapon, staring at the space where a man she'd only just met had disappeared into a killer storm to fix a window she'd broken. That's just his way, Maggie said, wrapping a thick shawl around Clara's shoulders. He'll act like it's a practical choice, like he's solving a problem instead of helping a person. But he's out there in the worst weather we've seen in decades because you're cold. Draw your own conclusions. He hates me. Oh, honey, Maggie guided her toward the door. If he hated you, he'd have let you freeze. Come on, we'll get tea in you while he does his dramatic rescue. It's not dramatic if nobody asked for it. Tell him that. I dare you. They made it downstairs just as the front door slammed open and Caleb stumbled in carrying boards, nails, and what looked like half the snow in Montana. His hair was white with ice. His hands were already turning blue. Caleb Mercer, you stupid man, Maggie started. Not now. He shook snow off like a dog, grabbed his tools, and headed back upstairs. Clara followed without thinking. You should stay down, Maggie called. But Clara was already climbing. She found Caleb in the guest room, pulling the blanket plug out of the window and measuring boards by candlelight while wind tried to tear everything away. What are you doing up here? He asked, without turning around. It's my window. Seems like I should help. You'll freeze. So will you. She picked up a board. Tell me what to do. For a moment she thought he'd refuse, thought he'd order her downstairs with all that cold authority he wore like armor. Instead he handed her nails. Hold this board steady. When I say move your hands. They worked in silence, illuminated by a single candle that kept threatening to blow out, while the storm tried to kill them through simple cold. Clara held boards while Caleb hammered, their breath misting in air that felt like broken glass. Her hands went numb, her feet stopped registering pain, which was probably bad. But something strange happened in that frozen room. The walls Caleb had mentioned, the ones built to keep everyone out, developed cracks. Why didn't you just leave me the blankets and fix this in the morning? Clara asked, teeth chattering. Blankets wouldn't hold, room would be destroyed by dawn. That's not an answer. Caleb positioned another board. Hold here. She held. He hammered 3 nails with brutal efficiency, each strike perfectly placed despite frozen fingers. I don't leave problems unfixed, he finally said. Not when I can solve them. Is that what I am? A problem? Yes. At least he was honest. They finished the window as Clara's hand stopped working entirely. Caleb stepped back, examined his work with critical eyes, then nodded once. It'll hold until morning. We can replace the glass after the storm. Thank you. I told you, I'm not thanking you for being practical. Clara wrapped Maggie's shawl tighter around herself. I'm thanking you for being human, even if you pretend you're not. His jaw tightened. In the candlelight, she could see old scars on his knuckles, new ice in his hair, and something in his eyes that might have been pain or might have been exhaustion. You can't sleep in here tonight, he said. Room's still too cold. I'll go back downstairs, sleep by the kitchen stove if Maggie allows it. She will. Maggie allows most things if you ask honest. They stood in that freezing room, 2 strangers covered in sawdust and snow, not quite looking at each other. Why did you really come here? Caleb asked suddenly. Clara considered lying, considered a dozen pretty answers that would soften the truth. Instead, she gave him what he'd given her. Honesty. Because I was dying in that town, slowly, invisibly. Everyone knew me as Tom Bennett's widow, the woman who stayed with a drunk, who cleaned up his messes, who smiled while disappearing piece by piece. I tried to build a new life after he died, tried to be someone different, but everywhere I went, I was still just the widow, still small, still quiet, still less. She pulled the shawl tighter. Ipetam. Then I heard about you, about the rancher who rejected 20 brides, and I thought, here's someone who understands walls, someone who knows what it's like to lock yourself away from everything that might hurt you. I didn't come here to marry you, Mr. Mercer. I came here because I thought, maybe, just maybe, if I could see someone else surviving their own isolation, I might figure out how to survive mine. The candle flickered. Wind screamed. Caleb stood very still, like a man who'd just been punched and was trying to decide whether to fall down. You're insane, he said finally. Probably. You rode into a mountain storm to find a stranger who might understand loneliness. When you say it like that, it sounds stupid. It is stupid. but his voice had lost some of its edge. "It's the stupidest thing I've heard in years." "I excel at stupid. It's practically a talent." Something happened to his face then, something small. His mouth didn't quite smile. Caleb Mercer didn't smile. But the corners softened. Just a fraction. Just enough. "Come on," he said, "before we both freeze to death and Jack has to explain to the sheriff why there are 2 corpses in the guest room." They went downstairs together. Maggie had somehow produced tea, bread, and a look of deep satisfaction that suggested she'd been listening to the entire conversation from the kitchen. "Suppose you'll be staying a few more days," she said to Clara. Not a question. Clara looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the window where snow was piling so high it had reached the sill. "Storm won't clear for at least 3 days," he said. "Possibly longer. Roads will be impassable for a week after that." "So I'm trapped here." "We're all trapped here." He accepted tea from Maggie, wrapped his frozen hands around the cup. "Might as well make use of it." "Make use of it how? You said you came to see someone surviving isolation." "Fine, watch, learn what you want, but don't expect friendship or comfort or whatever else you're looking for. I work, I eat, I sleep. That's the entire show." "Sounds thrilling." "It's honest." Clara almost laughed. Would have laughed if she wasn't so cold and tired and aware that she was stuck on a ranch with a man who radiated damage like heat from a stove. "Then I'll watch," she said, "and you'll pretend I'm not here. I'm good at pretending." "So am I." They drank tea in Maggie's kitchen while the storm tried to erase the world outside. 2 broken people pretending they hadn't just told each other the truth. And somewhere in the frozen mountains, the walls around Caleb Mercer's heart developed their first cracks in 13 years. Neither of them noticed yet, but Maggie did, and she smiled into her tea, saying nothing. The storm didn't stop for 3 days. On the first day, Clara woke in a makeshift bed near the kitchen stove to find the entire ranch buried under snow that had drifted higher than the first-floor windows. The world had turned white and silent except for wind that sounded like wolves. Maggie handed her coffee and bread without ceremony. "Boss is already in his study. Been up since 4. You want breakfast? It's on the stove. You want company? You're in the wrong house." Clara ate alone, watching snow pile against glass, and wondered what she'd actually expected to find here. By mid-morning, she was restless. The kitchen was warm, and Maggie was kind, but Clara hadn't ridden through a storm to sit quietly in a corner. She'd done that for 7 years with Tom. She was done being invisible. She found Caleb in his study, exactly where Maggie said he'd be, surrounded by papers and ledgers and maps marked with notes she couldn't read from the doorway. "Can I help?" she asked. He didn't look up. "No. I'm good with numbers. I kept Tom's books for years. Taught myself accounting because he couldn't manage it drunk. I manage fine." "I'm sure you do. But I'm going to lose my mind if I sit in that kitchen for 3 days with nothing to do." Now he looked up. His eyes were tired. He'd probably slept even less than she had. "This isn't a charity project, Mrs. Bennett. I don't need help. I don't want company. I'm perfectly content working alone." "No, you're not." His expression went dangerous. "Excuse me?" Clara stepped into the study, uninvited, and closed the door behind her. "You're not content. You're habituated. There's a difference. Content people don't reject 20 potential wives. Content people don't build houses this big and live in them alone. Content people don't work 15-hour days avoiding the fact that they're lonely. Get out." "No." That seemed to surprise him. Good. Clara was tired of being the kind of woman who left when men told her to. "I'm stuck here for at least a week," she continued. "Maybe longer. You're stuck with me. We can spend that time pretending I don't exist while you work yourself into exhaustion, or we can be adults and have an actual conversation. Your choice." Caleb stood slowly. He was a big man. She'd noticed that immediately. But up close, the size of him was almost intimidating. Almost. Clara had survived 7 years with a violent drunk. She wasn't easily scared anymore. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low. "I want you to stop pretending you're made of stone. I want you to admit that you're a person, not a fortress. I want—" She stopped, surprised by her own honesty. "I want to know if it's possible to survive being broken. Really survive, not just exist. Because I don't know how to do that, and you're the only person I've met who might understand." Silence filled the study. Outside, wind battered the walls. Caleb stared at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve, something that bothered him specifically because he was a man who solved everything. Sit down, he said finally. Clara sat. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle on his desk, handed her one, and took the chair across from her. You want to know if survival is possible? He drank, winced slightly. Here's your answer. I built this ranch from nothing. I run 5,000 acres. I employ 40 men year-round. I'm wealthier than I ever dreamed I'd be. And every single morning I wake up and feel absolutely nothing. No joy, no pain, just function. So yes, survival is possible, but I don't recommend it. Clara drank her own whiskey. It burned. Why did you reject those women? Because they wanted something I don't have. Money? You have plenty. A heart. He said it like he was discussing missing livestock. They all thought they could fix me, heal me, love me back into being human. They were wrong. I'm not fixable, Mrs. Bennet. I'm just functional. You fixed my window in the middle of a blizzard. That was practical. It was human. Don't confuse basic competence with humanity. Clara leaned forward. What happened to you? For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Thought she'd finally pushed too hard and he'd throw her out storm or no storm. Instead, he told her about Rachel. He told it like he was reading a contract, flat, emotionless, just facts arranged in chronological order. The girl he'd loved, the promises they'd made, the years he'd worked to build something worthy of her, the day he'd ridden into town with a ring and found her choosing money over everything they'd shared. She wasn't wrong, he said when the story was finished. I was a cowboy with dreams and dirt. He offered her safety, comfort, a life without struggle. She made the smart choice. The choice that destroyed you. The choice that taught me love is just another transaction. People take what they can get and leave when something better shows up. Now I know that up front. Saves everyone time. Clara finished her whiskey, set the glass down carefully. My husband used to hit me. Caleb's entire body went rigid. Not often, she continued, staring at her empty glass, and never where it showed. He'd get drunk, I'd say something wrong, and he'd shove me into a wall or grab my arm so hard it bruised. Then he'd cry, apologize, swear he'd never do it again, and I'd forgive him because I'd already spent so long making our marriage work that leaving felt like admitting failure. Did you ever think about killing him? The question was so casual it took her a moment to process. Every day, she admitted. But you didn't. No, I just waited. Made myself smaller and smaller until I was barely there at all. And then one day he drank bad whiskey, and his heart stopped, and I was free. Except I wasn't free because I'd forgotten how to be anything except his victim. She looked up, met Caleb's eyes. So yes, I understand transactions. I understand choosing safety over happiness. I understand building walls so high that nothing can hurt you anymore. But I also understand that we're both dying like this. Slowly. Invisibly. And I came here because I thought maybe, just maybe, 2 people who understand dying might figure out how to live. The study had gone completely silent. Caleb stood, walked to the window, stared at snow that had buried the world. I don't know how to live anymore, he said finally. I've forgotten. So have I. Then what are we doing? I don't know. Clara stood, joined him at the window. But at least we're not pretending anymore. They stood side by side, not quite touching, watching the storm rage while something between them shifted in a way neither could name yet. You can help with the books, Caleb said suddenly. The accounts from the Denver supplier are a mess. If you can make sense of them, I'll pay you standard bookkeeper wages. I don't want your money. Everyone wants money. I want to feel useful. There's a difference. He turned to look at her. Really look at her. And for the first time, Clara saw past the ice in his eyes to something underneath. Exhaustion, loneliness, and a kind of pain that mirrored her own. Fine, he said. Make yourself useful. But don't expect gratitude or friendship or whatever else people usually want. I'll try to contain my disappointment. His mouth almost smiled again. Almost. They worked together the rest of the day, paper spread across his desk, unraveling months of disorganized accounting while snow buried the ranch deeper. And if Caleb occasionally explained something without his usual coldness, and if Clara occasionally asked questions just to hear him talk, neither of them mentioned it. By nightfall, the storm had intensified. By midnight, the ranch house felt like a ship lost at sea. And somewhere in that frozen darkness, 2 people who'd forgotten how to be human started remembering what it felt like to have company. It wouldn't save them, not yet, but it was a start. The storm didn't break on the third day like Caleb predicted. It intensified. By dawn on the fourth morning, snow had buried the fence posts. Drifts reached the second-floor windows on the north side of the house. The barn was barely visible through white that fell so thick it looked solid. Jack came in from checking the animals with ice crusted in his beard and murder in his eyes. Lost 2 calves in the night, couldn't get to them fast enough. Rest of the herd sheltered, but we're running low on feed faster than expected. Caleb stood at the kitchen table, already dressed despite the early hour, studying maps he'd spread across Maggie's workspace. The reserve supply in the south barn? Snowed in. Can't reach it without digging, and we don't have enough hands. Half the men are stuck in the bunkhouse. Other half are stuck in town. Then we dig. In this? Boss, visibility's maybe 10 feet. Temperature's 20 below before accounting for wind. We go out there, we might not come back. We don't go out there, we lose the herd? Caleb traced a route on the map with one scarred finger. There's a path along the eastern ridge that should be partially sheltered. We rope ourselves together, take it slow, get to the south barn, and bring back what we can carry. That's suicide. It's necessary. Clara had been listening from the doorway, wrapped in a blanket Maggie had given her, watching Caleb plan to walk into a storm that was actively killing things. Something hot and angry rose in her chest. "You'll die," she said. Both men turned to look at her. "Probably not," Caleb said. "I've worked in worse." "That's a lie, and you know it. Jack just said visibility's 10 feet. You're talking about hiking a mile through snow in 20 below weather to reach a barn you might not even be able to find." "I know my land." "Your land is currently trying to kill you." Caleb's jaw tightened. "This doesn't concern you, Mrs. Bennett." "It concerns me if you freeze to death being stupidly heroic about cattle." "It's not heroic. It's practical. Those animals are worth—" "I don't care what they're worth." Clara stepped into the kitchen, dropping her blanket on a chair. "You're not going out there alone." "I'm not going alone. Jack's coming." "Like hell I am," Jack muttered, but he was already reaching for his coat because that's what Jack did. Maggie slammed a pot down on the stove hard enough to make everyone jump. "You're all idiots. Caleb, you want to die proving you're tougher than weather? Fine. Jack, you want to follow him into suicide because you've got some misplaced sense of loyalty? Also fine. But don't pretend this is about cattle. This is about you needing to control something in a storm you can't control, and it's going to get you killed." "The herd," Caleb started. "The herd will survive or it won't. That's ranching. You know that. What you're planning is a man refusing to sit still with his own thoughts for 5 minutes because sitting still means feeling something, and you'd rather freeze than feel." The kitchen went silent except for wind battering the walls. Caleb stood very still, his hands flat on the map, his face carved from stone. "I'm going." "Then I'm coming with you," Clara said. "Absolutely not. You need 3 people. 1 to dig, 1 to load, 1 to watch for whiteout conditions. That's basic safety protocol for blizzard work. I grew up in Dakota Territory. I know cold. You'll slow us down. I'll keep you alive. There's a difference." They stared at each other across Maggie's kitchen table like 2 animals deciding whether to fight or flee. Jack cleared his throat. "She's right about the 3-person minimum, boss. It's stupid to go with 2. "It's stupid to go at all," Maggie snapped. "But if we're going," Jack continued, ignoring her, "extra hands help." Caleb looked at Clara, really looked at her, and she saw him calculating her worth the same way he'd calculate the value of a horse or a tool. Not cruel, just practical. "Can you follow orders?" he asked. "Can you give them without being an ass about it?" His mouth twitched. Almost a smile. "Not quite. No promises." "Then we're even." 20 minutes later, Clara stood in the mudroom wearing layers of wool that smelled like they'd been stored in mothballs since the Civil War, watching Caleb tie rope around her waist with efficient, impersonal movements. "This connects all 3 of us," he explained, his breath misting in air cold enough to hurt. "We stay within arm's reach at all times. If someone falls, the others anchor. If visibility drops to nothing, we stop moving and wait it out. And if I give an order, you follow it immediately. No questions, no arguments. Understand?" "I understand that you're terrified I'm going to die, and you'll feel responsible." His hands paused on the rope. "I'm terrified you're going to die and slow us down enough that we all die. It's different." "Is it?" He pulled the rope tight, not enough to hurt, just enough to be sure, and met her eyes. "Don't make me regret this. Don't give me a reason to." They went out into the storm tied together like prisoners, with Jack in the lead and Caleb in the middle and Clara at the rear. And within 30 seconds, the world disappeared into white chaos. The cold hit like a physical thing, stealing breath and burning exposed skin. Wind screamed loud enough to make communication nearly impossible. Snow flew horizontal, turning the air into a solid wall of frozen knives. Clara couldn't see Jack, could barely see Caleb 2 feet ahead of her, could only follow the rope and trust that the men she was tied to knew where they were going. They moved slowly, each step deliberate, testing snow that could hide anything from solid ground to deadly drop-offs. Clara's legs burned within minutes. Her lungs ached from breathing air that felt like broken glass. Ice formed on her eyelashes, making it even harder to see. This was insane. Maggie had been right. They were going to die out here for cattle that might already be dead, and it was stupid, and Clara couldn't even feel her feet anymore. But she kept walking, because Caleb was ahead of her, pushing forward with the same grim determination he probably applied to everything, and something stubborn in Clara refused to be the one who quit first. The eastern ridge was supposed to provide shelter. It provided nothing except slightly different wind direction. They climbed through drifts that reached Clara's waist, Jack breaking trail while Caleb followed and Clara struggled to keep pace. Time stopped meaning anything. Could have been 10 minutes, could have been an hour. There was only white, cold, and the rope connecting her to 2 men who were probably as lost as she was, but too stubborn to admit it. Then Jack stopped so suddenly that Caleb nearly crashed into him, and Clara nearly crashed into Caleb. "There!" Jack shouted over the wind, pointing at a dark shape barely visible through the snow. The south barn materialized like a ghost, its roof heavy with white, its door frozen shut. They'd actually made it. Getting inside took another 10 minutes of digging and prying and swearing, but finally the door gave way and they stumbled into darkness that smelled like hay and old wood and felt like heaven compared to the storm outside. Clara collapsed against a wall, gasping, her entire body shaking from cold and exertion. Jack leaned on a support beam, breathing hard. Caleb was already moving toward the feed stores, all business, like he hadn't just hiked through conditions that should have killed them. "We've got maybe 30 minutes before we need to start back," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting over wind. "Load as much as we can carry. Clara, you take the lighter stuff. Jack, you and I will handle the heavy bales." "I can carry heavy," Clara protested. "You can barely stand. Don't argue." She wanted to argue, wanted to prove she was as strong as either of them, that bringing her hadn't been a mistake. But her legs were shaking and her hands weren't working right, and pride was a stupid reason to slow them down. So she loaded what she could carry while the men hauled bales that probably weighed as much as she did, and within 20 minutes they'd assembled more feed than any 3 people should be able to transport. "This is too much," Jack said. "We'll have to make 2 trips." "We're not making 2 trips. We take what we can now and come back when the storm breaks." "That could be days. Herd won't last." "Herd will have to last." Caleb was already tying loads together, creating bundles they could drag through the snow. His movements were precise, despite frozen fingers. "We're not dying for cattle, we're buying them time. That's all we can do." Clara watched him work. This man who claimed to feel nothing, who'd built walls around everything human inside him, and saw someone who absolutely did feel. He felt the weight of every animal under his care, every person depending on his decisions, every choice that might lead to loss. He just called it practical instead of admitting it hurt. "Caleb," she said quietly. He didn't look up. "What?" "Thank you for letting me come." Now he looked up. His face was raw from wind, his eyes exhausted, and something in his expression was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. "You're insane," he said. "So are you." "I know." They smiled at each other, actual smiles, small but real, and Jack made a disgusted noise. "You two done having a moment? Because I'd like to get back before my fingers fall off." The return trip was worse. They were tired now, hauling weight, fighting a storm that had somehow gotten even more violent. The rope connecting them felt like the only real thing in a world that had turned into pure chaos. Halfway back, Clara's foot went through weak snow and she dropped hard, her ankle twisting as she fell. Pain shot up her leg sharp enough to make her cry out. The rope went taut. Both men stopped immediately. Caleb was beside her in seconds, his hands on her shoulders. "What happened?" "Stepped wrong." "I'm fine." "Can you walk?" She tried to stand, her ankle screamed protest. "Yes." "That's a lie." "It's a functional lie. Keep moving. We stop if you're injured. We stop. We die. We die. Keep moving." They stared at each other, snow building on their shoulders, and Clara saw Caleb calculating again. Risk versus benefit. Speed versus safety. Leave her or slow down. "Jack," he called. "Take the front. I've got her." Before Clara could protest, Caleb had shifted his weight, positioning himself so she could lean on him while they walked. It should have been awkward, should have slowed them to a crawl. Instead, something clicked into place. They moved together like they'd been doing this for years instead of days. Caleb supporting her weight, Clara matching his pace despite pain that made her vision blur. Both of them pushing forward because stopping meant dying, and neither of them was ready to die yet. The ranch house appeared through the white like a miracle, and then Maggie was there. And Jack was helping Clara inside, and Caleb was securing the load they'd brought back, and Clara was sitting in a chair she didn't remember reaching while her boot was being cut off, and her ankle turned colors that probably weren't good. "Sprained," Maggie announced after examination that involved pressing things and asking if it hurt. "Not broken. You're lucky." "I'm stupid," Clara corrected. "That too." Caleb came in from securing the feed, his face still raw from cold, his clothes soaked through. He looked at Clara's ankle, looked at her face, and something complicated crossed his expression. "That was reckless," he said. "You're one to talk." "I know my limits." "So do I." "Clearly not, or you wouldn't have a foot the size of a melon." "At least I have a foot. We could all be frozen corpses if we'd stayed out there another 20 minutes. We wouldn't have needed to stay out there at all if you told me you were hurt. I told you I was fine." "You lied. You lie all the time. You lie every time you say you're content being alone. You lie every time you act like you don't care. You lie every single day by pretending you're not human." The kitchen went silent. Maggie made a strategic retreat toward the stove. Jack suddenly remembered he needed to check something in another room. Caleb stood in his soaked clothes, dripping melted snow on Maggie's floor, staring at Clara like she'd slapped him. "I don't lie," he said quietly. "Yes, you do. You lie to everyone, including yourself. You say you're practical when you're actually terrified. You say you're content when you're actually lonely. You built this entire life around not feeling anything, and you lie about it being a choice instead of admitting you're just scared. You don't know anything about me. I know you went into a killer storm for cattle you could have afforded to lose. I know you tied a rope around me to keep me safe, even though you claimed I'd slow you down. I know you carried half my weight on the way back because I was hurt. And you're standing here yelling at me for lying when you've been lying to yourself for 13 years. Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His jaw worked like he was chewing words too bitter to swallow. Then he turned and walked out, not to his study. Out the back door into the storm, without a coat. "Caleb!" Clara struggled to stand, her ankle making her gasp. Maggie put a hand on her shoulder. "Let him go. He'll freeze. He'll come back. He always does." Maggie guided Clara back into the chair. "That man's been running from his own feelings for so long, he doesn't know how to stand still with them. You just cornered him with truth he's been avoiding, and now he needs to decide if he's going to keep running or finally stop." "I shouldn't have said that." "Yes, you should. Someone needed to. One." Clara stared at the door Caleb had vanished through, her ankle throbbing, her whole body exhausted, and wondered if honesty was always this expensive. Caleb stood in the snow behind his house, coatless and freezing, and tried to remember how to breathe. His lungs hurt. His hands were going numb. Wind cut through his wet clothes like knives. Good. Pain was simple. Pain was concrete. Pain didn't ask complicated questions or force him to examine things he'd buried years ago. The problem was Clara was right. He did lie. To everyone. Constantly. He'd built an entire life around lies so smooth, he'd started believing them himself. The lie that he was content. The lie that isolation was choice instead of fear. The lie that Rachel breaking his heart had made him stronger instead of just making him careful. The lie that he didn't feel anything anymore. Except he'd felt plenty today. He'd felt terror when Clara's foot went through that snow. Felt relief when they made it back alive. Felt something uncomfortably close to happiness when she smiled at him in that barn. Her face raw from cold, but her eyes actually seeing him. He felt things constantly around Clara Bennett, and he hated it because feelings led to caring, and caring led to loss, and he'd already lost enough for one lifetime. The back door opened. Jack stepped out, coat buttoned to his chin, and stood beside Caleb without speaking. They watched snow fall in silence. "You're going to freeze to death," Jack finally said. "I'm aware. That going to solve your problems?" Might. Might also make you dead, which generally creates more problems than it solves. Caleb almost laughed. Would have laughed if his chest didn't feel like it was being crushed. She's leaving when the storm breaks. Is she? She should. Should, or you want her to? Both. Neither. I don't know. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, sending ice scattering. She walked into my house 5 days ago, and my entire life was fine. Organized. Simple. Now everything's complicated, and I can't think straight, and I'm standing outside freezing to death because I don't know how to handle one woman telling me the truth. The truth that you lie to yourself? The truth that I'm scared, that I've been scared for 13 years and I called it practical. Jack was quiet for a moment. You remember when you hired me? Of course, 15 years ago. You were working that ranch in Wyoming that went under. You know why I left Wyoming before it went under? Because the owner was a mean drunk who beat his workers when he got liquored up. I took it for 3 years because jobs were scarce and I needed money. Then one day he came at me with a branding iron and I broke his jaw. Had to run before the sheriff came. Caleb looked at his foreman. You never told me that. Never needed to. Point is, I spent 3 years lying to myself that staying was the smart choice. Practical choice. Safe choice. Then I nearly died because I was too scared to admit I deserved better. Jack met his boss's eyes. That woman in there? She deserves better than being sent away because you're too scared to try. I'll hurt her. Eventually. Everyone I care about either leaves or gets hurt. Maybe. Or maybe you'll both hurt each other a little and heal each other a lot and build something real. But you'll never know if you keep running. I don't know how to stop running. Start by going inside before your fingers fall off. Then maybe try talking to her like she's a person instead of a problem you need to solve. Jack went back in, leaving Caleb alone with the storm and his own thoughts, and the slowly dawning realization that he'd built his entire adult life around avoiding this exact moment. The moment when he had to choose between safety and possibility. He stood there until he couldn't feel his hands. Then he chose. Clara was still in the kitchen when Caleb came back inside, her ankle propped on a chair, wrapped in bandages and ice that Maggie had somehow produced. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded. You didn't freeze, she said. I considered it. He stood dripping in the doorway, looking like something that had barely survived a war. Can we talk? About how I overstepped and should mind my own business? About how you were right and I'm an idiot. That clearly wasn't what she expected. Her eyes widened slightly. Oh. Jack's bringing coffee to my study. Come with me. Please. The please cost him something. She could see it in the way he said the word, like he was out of practice asking instead of ordering. Maggie helped Clara stand, handed her a makeshift crutch, and gave Caleb a look that promised violence if he screwed this up. They made it to the study in awkward silence, Clara hobbling, Caleb keeping pace beside her but not quite touching, both of them hyper-aware of the other. The study felt smaller with both of them in it. Warmer. Caleb poured coffee with hands that were still shaking from cold, handed Clara a cup, and sat across from her like they were negotiating a business deal instead of trying to have an actual human conversation. I don't know how to do this, he said finally. Do what? Be honest. About things that matter. He stared into his coffee. Rachel destroyed something in me. I know that's not an excuse. I know 13 years is too long to blame one woman for all my problems. But when she left, she proved that love is temporary, and trust is stupid, and caring about someone just gives them power to hurt you. So I stopped. I stopped caring, stopped trying, built walls and called it wisdom. Clara waited, didn't interrupt, just listened. Then you showed up, Caleb continued, and you saw through every single wall in about 5 minutes. You called me scared when I've spent years pretending I'm just careful. You made me feel things I've been avoiding, and it terrifies me because the last time I let myself care about someone, she left me broken. So you'd rather be alone forever than risk being broken again? Yes. No, I don't know anymore. He finally looked up, met her eyes. Before you came here, my life made sense. Now nothing makes sense, and I'm standing outside in storms and yelling in kitchens, and I don't recognize myself anymore. Is that bad? I don't know. Is it? Clara set her coffee down carefully. Tom broke me. Not all at once. Slowly. Each time he drank too much, each time he got angry, each time I made myself smaller to keep the peace. By the time he died, I barely existed. I was just this quiet thing that cleaned up messes and apologized for breathing. And when people told me I should be relieved he was gone, I felt guilty because I wasn't relieved. I was just empty. She picked at the bandage on her ankle. I came here because I was tired of being empty, tired of pretending that surviving was the same as living. I didn't expect to find someone who understood. Didn't expect to care whether a stubborn rancher froze to death being heroic about cattle, but I do care. And that terrifies me too, because the last time I cared about someone, it nearly killed me. They sat in that study, two people scared of the same things for different reasons, while the storm continued erasing the world outside. I don't know what happens next, Caleb said. Neither do I. I might hurt you, not on purpose, but I've forgotten how to be gentle with people. I might hurt you too. I've forgotten how to take up space without apologizing for it. So we're both disasters. Apparently. Caleb almost smiled. What do you want, Clara? Really want? Not what you think you should want or what's practical. What do you actually want? Clara considered lying, considered saying something safe and easy that wouldn't risk anything. Instead, she gave him what he'd given her, truth. I want to stay. Not forever. I don't know about forever, but I want to stay long enough to see if two broken people can build something that isn't about fear. I want to wake up in the morning and not feel empty. I want to matter, even if it's just here on this ranch in this storm. I want to matter. The study was very quiet. Caleb stood slowly, walked to the window, stared at white that had buried everything familiar. Stay, he said without turning around. What? Stay. Work here. Maggie needs help, and you're good with numbers, and the house is too big for one person anyway. Now he turned, his expression careful. Not as my wife. Not as anything except someone who works here and lives here, and maybe we figure out the rest as we go. No promises. No expectations. Just stay. Clara's throat felt tight. As an employee. As someone who's here because she wants to be, not because she has nowhere else to go. I'll pay you fair wages. You'll have your own room, your own space. And if you decide you want to leave, you leave. No obligations. Why? Because you're right. I've been lying to myself for 13 years. And maybe I don't know how to stop all at once. But I know I don't want you to leave when the storm ends. That's the most honest I can be right now. Clara stood, balancing carefully on her good ankle, and crossed the study to where Caleb stood backlit by the window. I'll stay, she said. On one condition. What condition? You stop pretending you're made of stone. You don't have to be open or vulnerable or any of those things you're clearly terrible at. But you have to stop lying about being content. You have to admit you're a person who feels things, even if those things scare you. That's not a small condition. It's the only one that matters. They stood close enough that Clara could see the ice melting in Caleb's hair, could count the old scars on his knuckles, could feel the warmth radiating off him despite the cold that still clung to his clothes. I don't know if I can do that, he admitted. Try. That's all I'm asking. Try. He held out his hand. Not romantic, just practical. A deal being struck between two people who understood contracts better than emotions. Clara shook it. His hand was still freezing. Hers was warm from coffee. Together they made something almost comfortable. I'm a terrible boss, Caleb warned. I'm a terrible employee. This is going to be a disaster. Probably. They shook on disaster. And somewhere in that handshake something shifted. Not love, not yet. Maybe not ever, but possibility. The fragile, terrifying possibility that two people who'd forgotten how to live might remember together. The storm finally broke on the 7th day. Clara woke to silence so profound it felt wrong. She hobbled to the window. Her ankle was healing, but still complained, and found a world transformed. Snow covered everything in unmarked white that sparkled under sun so bright it hurt to look at directly. The sky had turned that particular blue that only appeared after major storms, and the air was so cold and clear it looked like glass. Maggie found her staring. Beautiful, isn't it? Terrifying, all that white. Makes you realize how small we are, how much we can't control. Maggie handed her coffee. Boss is already out with Jack, checking damage. They'll be at it all day. Should I help? With that ankle? You should rest. But resting had never been Clara's strength. By mid-morning, she was in Caleb's study, working through accounts while her ankle propped on a stool. By afternoon, she'd found three major discrepancies in the Denver supplier's billing and saved the ranch enough money to make the storm losses almost irrelevant. Caleb found her there at sunset, exhausted and covered in snow, holding a ledger she'd marked in red. "What's this?" "Proof that your supplier's been overcharging you for 6 months. You're owed about $3,000, give or take." He stared at the numbers. Stared at her. "How did you find this?" "I'm good at finding things people try to hide. Comes from years of checking Tom's pockets for bottles." She said it casually, but Caleb heard the pain underneath. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "Thank you. You're paying me to do this. I'm paying you to help. You're doing more than helping." "Don't get sentimental on me, Mercer. I found some math errors. It's not a miracle." But he was looking at her in that way he sometimes did now, like he was trying to figure out how she'd become important without him noticing. "Storm's over," he said. "I noticed. Roads will be clear in a few days." "Probably. You could leave, if you wanted." Clara set down the ledger. "Is that what you want?" "No." He said it immediately, no hesitation. "But I don't want you staying out of obligation either, or because you think you owe me something. If you stay, it should be because you want to." "I already told you I want to stay. That was before you saw how bad the storms get here. Before you hurt yourself helping with cattle. Before you realized what you were signing up for." Clara leaned back in her chair, studying this complicated man who'd somehow become her employer, and maybe, possibly, something else she didn't have words for yet. "I grew up in storms worse than this," she said. "I survived a marriage that nearly killed me. I rebuilt myself from nothing after Tom died. I'm not fragile, Caleb. I'm not going to break because Montana has weather. I'm not worried about Montana's weather." "What are you worried about?" He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the sun finished setting, turning snow from white to blue to shadow. "I'm worried I'll hurt you," he finally said. "Not on purpose, but I don't know how to do this. How to have someone here who matters. I'm good at being alone. I'm terrible at everything else." "Then we'll both be terrible together. That's the deal." "That's a bad deal." "It's the only deal I'm offering." They sat in the growing darkness while the first stars appeared over mountains that had tried to kill them and failed. "Okay," Caleb said. "Okay, what?" "Okay, you stay. Okay, we're both terrible. Okay, I'm going to try not lying to myself even though it's uncomfortable." He stood, moved toward the door, then stopped. "Thank you. For the accounts, for staying, for calling me out when I'm being an idiot. For all of it. Careful, Mercer. That almost sounded like genuine emotion. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to maintain." He left before she could respond, but Clara sat in that study with a smile on her face and the strange, unfamiliar feeling that she was exactly where she needed to be. The ranch settled into new rhythms after the storm. Clara moved her things into a room on the second floor that had probably been designed for guests who never came. She worked mornings in Caleb's study, managing accounts and correspondence, and revealing a talent for organization that impressed even Maggie. Afternoons she spent helping around the house, learning to cook things that didn't taste like survival, and slowly, carefully, building something that almost resembled a life. Caleb remained Caleb, cold, practical, more comfortable with cattle than people. But small things changed. He started eating dinner with Clara and Maggie instead of alone in his study. He asked Clara's opinion on ranch decisions. He stopped pretending he didn't care when she winced on her healing ankle. They were careful with each other, polite, like two people handling something fragile they didn't quite trust yet. But spring was coming to the Montana mountains, and spring had a way of breaking things wide open. March arrived with mud that turned the ranch roads into rivers of brown sludge, and temperatures that couldn't decide if they wanted to freeze or thaw. The cattle had survived the winter leaner than Caleb would have liked, but alive, and the ranch hands returned from town with stories about the storm that had already grown into legend. Clara had been living at the ranch for 6 weeks when the first real fight happened. It started over something stupid. It always did. She'd reorganized Caleb's study while he was out checking fence lines, creating a filing system that actually made sense instead of his method of important things on the left, everything else wherever it lands. She thought she was being helpful. She thought he'd appreciate coming home to order instead of chaos. She was wrong. "Where's the contract with the railway?" Caleb stood in the study doorway, covered in mud from a morning spent wrestling with fence posts, his voice dangerously quiet. Clara looked up from the ledger she was updating. Third drawer, filed under R for railway. I created an alphabetical system. Everything's labeled. I don't want an alphabetical system. I want my things where I put them. Your things were scattered across 4 different piles with no organization. I found one contract stuffed inside a book about cattle breeding. How is that functional? It was functional because I knew where everything was. Now I don't know where anything is because you decided to play house with my office. The words hit harder than he probably intended. Clara's hand stilled on the ledger. Play house? She repeated, her voice very calm. I've been managing your accounts for 6 weeks. I found over $5,000 in billing errors. I've organized correspondence you'd been ignoring for months. But sure, I'm playing house. I didn't ask you to reorganize my study. I asked you to help with bookkeeping. The study needed organizing. It was a disaster. It was my disaster. This is my ranch, my house, my life. I don't need you coming in and changing everything because you think you know better. Clara stood slowly, her ankle completely healed now, her body very still the way it used to get when Tom started yelling. Is that what this is about? Me changing things? It's about you overstepping. We had an arrangement. You do the books, I run the ranch. We stay out of each other's way. We eat dinner together every night. We talk for hours. You asked my opinion on buying new breeding stock last week. But sure, we're staying out of each other's way. Caleb's jaw tightened. That's different. How is it different? Because dinner and conversation don't involve touching my things without permission. Your things were a mess. I fixed it. You're welcome. I didn't ask you to fix it. Stop fixing things that aren't broken. It was broken. You just couldn't see it because you're so used to dysfunction that you think it's normal. The study went very quiet. Caleb took one step into the room, his body coiled tight with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. Careful, Clara. Or what? You'll fire me. Send me away? Prove that you were right about not letting people close because they always disappoint you eventually? You're twisting this into something it's not. I'm calling it what it is. You're picking a fight because I did something nice and it scared you. Because nice things lead to caring, and caring leads to loss, and you'd rather be angry than vulnerable. You reorganize my study. Don't make it into some deep psychological crisis. It's not about the study and you know it. They stood on opposite sides of the desk, 2 people who'd gotten too close too fast and were now paying the price, while mud from Caleb's boots spread across the floor Clara had cleaned that morning. I want everything put back the way it was, Caleb said flatly. No. That's not a request, it's an order. Then fire me, because I'm not undoing 6 hours of work because you're afraid of filing cabinets. I'm not afraid. Yes, you are. You're terrified. You've been terrified since the day I got here. You're terrified I'll leave like Rachel did. You're terrified I'll stay and you'll actually have to feel something. You're terrified that maybe, possibly, you're not as content being alone as you've spent 13 years claiming. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. Get out. What? Get out of my study. Now. Clara stared at him, her heart hammering, seeing the walls slam back up behind his eyes. This was it. The moment she'd known was coming since she'd agreed to stay. The moment when Caleb's fear won and he pushed away anything that threatened his carefully constructed isolation. She could fight, could refuse to leave, could force him to actually fire her if he wanted her gone. Instead, she walked out. Not because she was scared, but because fighting a man who was actively building walls was pointless. She'd learned that with Tom. You couldn't break through walls from the outside. People had to choose to open them. She went to the kitchen where Maggie was kneading bread with the focused violence of someone who'd heard the entire fight through thin walls. He's an idiot, Maggie said without preamble. I know. You reorganized his study. I know that too. He hates change. Everyone hates change, Maggie. That doesn't mean it's not necessary. Clara sat heavily at the table, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. I shouldn't have touched his things without asking. That was wrong, but he's using it as an excuse to push me away because we were getting too close. Of course he is. That's what he does. Maggie shaped dough with practiced hands. Question is, what are you going to do about it? I don't know. What can I do? I can't force him to let me in. No. But you can decide if he's worth waiting for. Clara thought about Caleb fixing her window in a blizzard. Thought about him tying rope around her waist to keep her safe. Thought about the way he'd started smiling, actually smiling, when she made sarcastic comments during dinner. Thought about the man underneath all that fear, who was desperately trying to remember how to be human. "He's worth waiting for," she said quietly. "Then wait. But don't make it easy on him. Men like Caleb need to be challenged, not coddled." "What does that mean?" Maggie smiled grimly. "It means you stop apologizing for taking up space. Stop asking permission to exist. You want to organize his study? Organize it. You want to plant a garden? Plant it. You want to tell him he's being an idiot? Tell him. Make him choose between his fear and his life, because right now he's choosing fear, and fear's going to kill him slower than any storm." Clara sat with that advice while Maggie baked and the afternoon sun turned the muddy ranch into something almost beautiful. Caleb didn't come to dinner that night, or the next night. On the third night, Clara had had enough. She found him in the barn after dark, supposedly checking on a mare that was close to foaling, but actually just hiding. He looked up when she entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Mare's fine," he said. "No need to check on me. I'm not here about the mare." Clara walked into the barn, her boots squelching in mud and straw. "I'm here because you've been avoiding me for 3 days and we need to talk." "Nothing to talk about." "Really?" "Because I think there's plenty to talk about, starting with you picking a fight over filing cabinets." "I asked you not to touch my things. You touched them anyway. That's the end of it." "It's not the end of anything. It's the beginning of you sabotaging this before it becomes something real." Caleb stood, brushing straw off his pants. "There's no this. You work here. I pay you. That's the arrangement. That was the arrangement 6 weeks ago. Things change. I don't want them to change. Too late. They already have." Clara moved closer, forcing him to either back up or hold his ground. He held his ground. "You asked me to stay. You asked me to stop you from lying to yourself. Now I'm here, I'm staying, and I'm telling you the truth. You're terrified of me." "I'm not. Not because I'm dangerous. Because I'm here. Because I see you. Because for the first time in 13 years, someone's looking at you and not seeing money or power or a fortress. Just Caleb. And that terrifies you because if I'm here and I'm real and I matter, then losing me would actually hurt." The barn was very quiet except for horses shifting in their stalls. Caleb stared at her like she was a puzzle that kept changing shape before he could solve it. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I do. Because I'm terrified too. I'm terrified that I'm making the same mistake I made with Tom, staying somewhere I shouldn't, caring about someone who can't care back, wasting my life on someone else's fear. But the difference between you and Tom is that Tom was broken and refused to admit it. You're broken and you know it. You're just too scared to try fixing it. Some things can't be fixed. Some things can't be fixed alone. That's why people need other people." "I don't need anyone." "Yes, you do. You need me. You need Maggie. You need Jack. You need all of us walking around this ranch reminding you that you're human. You're just too stubborn to admit it." Caleb's hands clenched. "You want to know why I picked that fight? Fine. I picked it because you were making my study into a home. Because you were taking this house I built to be alone in and turning it into something that felt alive. Because every time I walked into that study and saw your handwriting on labels and your organizational system making sense of my chaos, I was reminded that you're here and you're real, and eventually you'll leave because everyone leaves. So yes, I picked a fight, because fighting is easier than caring." Clara felt something crack open in her chest. Not breaking, opening. "I'm not Rachel," she said quietly. "I know. I'm not going to leave you for someone richer or more successful or more put together. You don't know that. You can't promise that. You're right. I cannot promise I'll never leave. Life happens. People change. But I can promise I'm not leaving because you're difficult or damaged or scared. I've seen difficult. I've survived damaged. Your version is nothing compared to what I've already lived through. Then why stay? Why put yourself through this? Because for the first time in years, I don't feel empty. Because when I wake up in the morning, I have a reason to get up. Because you make me laugh and you challenge me and you look at me like I'm worth something instead of just someone who exists in the background of other people's lives." She took another step closer. "I'm not asking you to marry me, Caleb. I'm not even asking you to love me. I'm just asking you to stop pushing me away every time you get scared. Let me in. Not all the way. Not all at once. Just enough that we can figure out what this is together instead of you deciding alone that it's doomed to fail." The mare in the corner stall made a low noise. Caleb glanced at her automatically, checking that she was okay, then looked back at Clara. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice rough. Neither do I. So we'll figure it out together. We'll make mistakes. We'll fight. We'll probably hurt each other. But we'll do it honestly instead of hiding behind walls and fear. What if I hurt you the way Tom did? You won't. You're not him. You can't know that. Yes, I can. Because Tom hurt me to make himself feel powerful. You hurt yourself to avoid feeling anything at all. That's different. Clara reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and took his hand. It was rough from work, scarred from years of labor, and warm. I'm not asking for perfect. I'm asking for real. Can you give me that? Caleb looked at their joined hands like he was seeing something impossible. His thumb moved across her knuckles in a gesture so small and tentative it nearly broke her heart. I'll try, he said finally, but I'm going to be terrible at it. I'm counting on it. Something loosened in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. You're the most stubborn man. We're well matched. This is a terrible idea. Probably. They stood in that barn holding hands like awkward teenagers while horses watched with the patient indifference of animals who'd seen everything, and something fragile and new took root in the space between them. I'm sorry, Caleb said quietly, for the fight, for avoiding you, for being an ass. I'm sorry too, for reorganizing without asking, for pushing too hard. Don't apologize for that. Someone needs to push me. I'm too good at standing still. Then I'll keep pushing. Please do. They stayed like that for a while, not talking, just existing in the same space without walls or fear or lies. Then the mare made another noise, and Caleb remembered why he was supposed to be in the barn, and Clara helped him check on her, even though she knew nothing about horses. And when they finally walked back to the house together, something had shifted. Not fixed, not perfect, just different. The next morning, Clara woke to find a note on her door in Caleb's angular handwriting. Study organization is good. Thank you. Don't get used to compliments. She smiled and tucked the note into her pocket. Spring arrived in earnest after that, turning the Montana mountains from white to green seemingly overnight. Snow melted into rivers that fed valleys that exploded with wildflowers. The ranch shifted into calving season, which meant long days and longer nights, and everyone working until exhaustion became normal. Clara discovered she liked ranch work. Not the heavy lifting, her frame wasn't built for hauling feed, but the rhythm of it. The way each day had clear tasks and measurable progress. The way you could see the results of your labor in healthy calves and organized accounts, and a house that no longer echoed with emptiness. She also discovered she liked watching Caleb work. He was different when he was focused on cattle instead of emotions. Confident, decisive, almost relaxed. She saw why his men respected him. Not because he was rich or powerful, but because he worked alongside them, never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and made decisions that balanced profit with animal welfare. You're staring, Maggie said one afternoon, catching Clara watching Caleb through the kitchen window as he helped Jack deliver a difficult calf. I'm observing, Clara corrected. You're staring like a woman who's halfway to falling and doesn't want to admit it. Clara pulled her attention away from the window. It's not like that. No? What's it like then? It's complicated. Love usually is. It's not love, it's barely friendship. We're still figuring out how to be in the same room without fighting. You fight because you care. People who don't care don't bother fighting. Maggie handed Clara a bowl of vegetables to chop. Question is, what are you going to do about it? About what? About caring for a man who spent 13 years convinced caring is dangerous. Clara started chopping carrots with more force than necessary. I'm not doing anything about it. I'm staying. I'm working. I'm being honest. That's all I can control. And if he never lets you all the way in, then at least I tried. That's more than I can say about the last 7 years of my life. Maggie smiled. You're good for him, whether he admits it or not. I'm not trying to be good for him. I'm just trying to be honest. Same thing for a man like Caleb. That night at dinner, Caleb asked Clara if she wanted to help him with a project. What kind of project? She asked, immediately suspicious. Caleb wasn't a project person. He was a work until you drop then work some more person. There's space behind the kitchen that's been sitting empty for years. I thought maybe you'd want to use it. Use it for what? Whatever you want. Storage, workspace. Maggie mentioned you used to garden before. He trailed off, not quite saying Tom's name. If you wanted to plant something, that space gets good sun. Clara stared at him. You're offering me a garden? I'm offering you space. What you do with it is your choice. Why? Because you live here now. You should have something that's yours. It was such a simple thing, such a small gesture. But Clara felt it settle into her chest like warmth, like proof that she wasn't just temporary or convenient or a problem to be solved. She was someone who deserved space, someone who mattered enough to consider. Thank you, she said quietly. It's just dirt. It's not just dirt. He knew it wasn't. She could see it in the way he looked at her, careful but not cold, aware but not afraid. Clara started her garden the next day. Maggie helped her plan it, suggesting vegetables that grew well in Montana's short season and herbs that would be useful for cooking. Jack's teenage son hauled manure from the barn to enrich the soil, and Caleb appeared one morning with seeds he'd ordered from a catalog, claiming he'd found them in the barn and they might as well not go to waste. It was a lie, a kind lie. But Clara didn't call him on it. She planted tomatoes and beans and lettuce, planted herbs in neat rows, planted flowers along the edges because flowers weren't practical, but they were beautiful, and she was done limiting herself to only practical things. The work was hard. Her hands blistered. Her back ached. But every evening she'd stand in that space behind the kitchen and look at dirt that held seeds that would become food and flowers, and feel something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Caleb found her there one evening in early May, covered in soil, watering new seedlings that had just started to emerge. It's growing, he observed. That's what plants do. I meant it's actually growing. I thought maybe Montana would be too harsh. Montana's only as harsh as you let it be. He smiled at that. Actually smiled. Are we still talking about plants? Maybe. He sat on the edge of the garden bed, careful not to crush anything, and watched her work. Rachel used to talk about gardening, about how she'd have a huge garden when we finally had a real house, flowers everywhere, vegetables, maybe fruit trees. It was the first time he'd mentioned Rachel without bitterness edging his voice. Clara kept watering. Did she actually like gardening, or did she just like the idea of it? The idea, probably. She liked beautiful things, didn't want to work for them, just wanted to have them. I like working for things, makes them mean more. I've noticed. They sat in comfortable silence while evening turned the mountains purple, and Clara's garden drank water, and somewhere in the distance cattle lowed and the world felt almost perfect. I think I'm starting to not hate this, Caleb said suddenly. The garden? All of it. You being here, the house feeling different, eating dinner with people instead of alone. I spent 13 years building a fortress, and now you're here knocking holes in the walls and planting flowers in the gaps. I should hate it, but I don't. Clara set down her watering can. Is that okay? That you don't hate it? I don't know. It's different. Different scares me. Different scares everyone. That's how you know it matters. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not walls, not fear, just possibility. I'm glad you stayed, he said. I'm glad you let me. They didn't kiss, didn't touch, but something passed between them in that garden that was more intimate than either, understanding. The recognition that they were building something neither could name yet, planting seeds that might become something real if they were careful and patient and brave. The peaceful weeks didn't last. In late May, a woman arrived at the ranch in a carriage that screamed money, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Clara made in a year, and asking for Caleb Mercer with the confidence of someone who expected to be welcomed. Clara was working in the study when Jack came to find her, his expression troubled. There's a woman at the door, says she's an old friend of the boss. Name's Victoria Harrison. Something cold settled in Clara's stomach. Did Caleb know she was coming? Says it's a surprise. Should I get him from the north pasture? No, I'll handle it. Clara found the woman waiting in the front parlor that nobody ever used, examining the room with eyes that cataloged everything valuable while pretending to simply admire the decor. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, polished, perfect, and completely inaccessible. Maybe 40 years old, maybe younger, dark hair arranged in elaborate curls, rings on every finger, the kind of woman who'd never had a callus in her life. You must be the housekeeper, Victoria said when Clara entered. Not a question, an assumption. I'm Clara Bennett. I manage Mr. Mercer's accounts and correspondence. How modern. Caleb always did have unusual ideas about staff. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. I'm Victoria Harrison. Caleb and I are old friends from San Francisco. I was passing through the territory and thought I'd visit. Passing through. Nobody passed through this part of Montana. You came here on purpose or not at all? Mr. Mercer is out with the herd. I can send someone to fetch him if you'd like. Oh, no need. I'll wait. We have so much to catch up on. Victoria settled into a chair like she owned it. How long have you worked for Caleb? A few months? And how do you find it? Working for such a solitary man? The way she said solitary made it sound like something wrong, something that needed fixing. I find it suits me, Clara said evenly. I'm sure, though I imagine it must be lonely out here. No society, no culture, just cattle and cowboys. Victoria examined her perfectly manicured nails. I've been trying to convince Caleb for years to sell this place and move somewhere civilized. San Francisco, perhaps, or Denver. Somewhere his talents wouldn't be wasted on livestock. Clara felt ice form in her veins. I don't think Mr. Mercer considers his work a waste. No, I suppose he wouldn't. Caleb always was stubborn. That's why I'm here, actually, to make one more attempt at talking sense into him. Before Clara could respond, the front door opened and Caleb walked in, still covered in dust from riding, stopping dead when he saw who was sitting in his parlor. Victoria. His voice was flat, completely emotionless. What are you doing here? Victoria stood, gliding toward him with practiced grace. Darling, is that any way to greet an old friend? I've traveled all the way from San Francisco to see you. I didn't invite you. You never invite anyone. That's why I had to surprise you. She reached out to touch his arm. He stepped back. We need to talk, Caleb. About your future. About opportunities you're ignoring while you hide out here playing cowboy. I'm not playing anything. This is my life. This is you running away from what happened with Rachel. It's been 13 years. Don't you think it's time to move on? Clara watched Caleb's face close down like shutters slamming. Watched him retreat behind walls she'd spent weeks carefully dismantling. I've moved on, he said coldly. Have you? Because from where I'm standing, you're still here in the middle of nowhere, alone, refusing every chance at real success. Victoria's voice took on a coaxing tone. I have investors interested in your methods. People who want to bring modern ranching techniques to California. You could consult, travel, make real money instead of scratching out an existence in these mountains. I make plenty of money. You make survival money. I'm talking about wealth. Real wealth. The kind that would let you live like you deserve instead of like some frontier hermit. Clara had heard enough. She stood, drawing Victoria's attention. Mr. Mercer, she said formally, you have contracts that need signing before end of day. Should I prepare them in your study? It was a lie. There were no contracts. But Caleb understood immediately. She was giving him an escape. Yes. Thank you, Miss Bennett. He turned to Victoria. You'll have to excuse me. Business doesn't stop for surprise visits. Surely business can wait. It can't. Jack will show you to a guest room if you're staying. Dinner's at 6. He walked past her toward the study without another word. Victoria watched him go, her perfect composure cracking slightly. He's even worse than I remembered. He's exactly who he's supposed to be, Claire said quietly. Good day, Mrs. Harrison. She left before Victoria could respond. She found Caleb in the study, standing at the window, his hands braced on the sill, breathing carefully like a man trying not to break something. Thank you, he said without turning, for the escape. Who is she really? Exactly who she said, old friend from San Francisco. I knew her through business connections years ago. She's been trying to get me to sell the ranch and move to California since Rachel left. She seems very invested in your future. She's invested in what my methods could make her. Victoria's husband owns half the agricultural development in Northern California. She thinks I'd be more useful there than here. What do you think? He finally turned to face her. I think she represents everything I hate. Manipulation disguised as friendship. Business disguised as caring. She doesn't give a damn about me. She wants my expertise and my connections, and she's willing to pretend we're friends to get them. Why did you let her in? Because saying no would have required explaining why I was saying no, and I don't explain myself to Victoria Harrison. He rubbed his face tiredly. She'll stay a day, maybe 2, making her pitch about California and modern ranching and how I'm wasting my life. Then she'll leave, and I won't hear from her for another year. And in the meantime? In the meantime, I'll be polite and distant and count the hours until she's gone. Clara studied him, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders had tensed the moment Victoria appeared. Do you want me to make her leave? Can you do that? I can be very persuasive when I need to be. He almost smiled. I believe you, but no. Victoria needs to feel like she tried. Otherwise, she'll just come back. Better to let her fail quickly. All right, but Caleb, yeah? Don't let her make you doubt what you've built here. This ranch, this life, it's real. It matters. Don't let someone who values profit over people convince you otherwise. Something shifted in his expression. How do you always know what I need to hear? Because I've spent my whole life listening to what people don't say. You get good at reading between the lines. They stood in that study while afternoon light painted everything gold, and Caleb made a decision that would change everything. Have dinner with us tonight, he said. Not as staff, as an equal. I want Victoria to see that this house isn't empty, that I'm not alone. Claire's heart kicked against her ribs. As an equal. As someone who belongs here as much as I do. It was the closest thing to a declaration he'd ever given her, and they both knew it. Okay, Clara said. I'll have dinner with you. Thank you. Stop thanking me for existing in your life, Caleb. It's starting to get weird. He actually laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised and genuine, and Clara felt something settle into place between them that had been building since the day she'd ridden through a storm to reach his gate. This wasn't friendship anymore. It was becoming something else entirely. And dinner with Victoria Harrison was about to test exactly how strong that something was. Dinner was set for 6, which gave Clara exactly 2 hours to prepare herself for what would either be a perfectly civil meal or an absolute disaster. Maggie cornered her in the kitchen while she was trying to decide what to wear. You know what she's doing, right? Victoria? She's trying to convince Caleb to sell the ranch and move to California. She's marking territory. Coming here unannounced, talking about his future like she has a say in it. Staying for dinner, even though she clearly wasn't invited. Maggie slammed dough onto the counter with unnecessary force. That woman wants Caleb, maybe for business, maybe for something else. Either way, she's not going to like you sitting at that table as an equal. I don't care what she likes. Good, because she's going to try to put you in your place, remind you that you're staff, not family, make you feel small. Maggie pointed a flour-covered finger at Clara. Don't let her. You belong at that table. Caleb asked you there. That means something. Clara knew it meant something. That was exactly why her hands were shaking as she tried to button the one decent dress she owned. A simple gray thing she'd mended so many times, the original stitching was barely visible. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her room and saw what Victoria would see, a woman wearing a dress that had been out of fashion 5 years ago, with hands that showed work instead of leisure, and hair that couldn't hold an elaborate style if her life depended on it. Next to Victoria's polished perfection, Clara would look exactly like what she was, a widow from nowhere with nothing to offer except stubbornness and honesty. But Caleb had asked her to dinner, as an equal, and Clara was done making herself small to make other people comfortable. She went downstairs at 6 exactly and found Victoria already seated in the dining room, transformed into an evening gown that probably cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe. Caleb sat at the head of the table in clothes that were clean but practical, clearly refusing to dress up for someone who'd invited herself. He stood when Clara entered, a gesture that made Victoria's perfectly painted smile tighten. Miss Bennet, he said formally. Please, sit. Clara took the seat across from Victoria, her spine straight, her chin up, and met the other woman's appraising gaze without flinching. What a charming dress, Victoria said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. So practical. I imagine that's important out here where fashion isn't exactly a priority. Fashion's fine, Clara replied evenly, but it doesn't accomplish much when you're balancing ledgers or managing correspondence. No, I suppose it doesn't, though surely Caleb has proper accountants for that sort of work. He does. I'm one of them. Maggie appeared with the first course, soup that smelled like heaven and probably tasted like vindication, and the meal began. Victoria dominated conversation with stories about San Francisco society, dropping names like they were supposed to mean something and describing parties and galas with the kind of detail that suggested she thought everyone cared about who wore what to which function. Caleb responded with polite monosyllables, eating methodically, his expression giving away nothing. Clara mostly listened, watching the performance, understanding that every story about San Francisco society was really a reminder of everything Caleb had given up by staying in Montana. And of course, the Vanderbilt reception was absolutely spectacular, Victoria was saying. Everyone who matters was there. The governor, the railway magnates, several senators. I told Arthur, that's my husband, that you would have loved it, Caleb. All those connections, all those opportunities, wasted because you insist on staying out here in the wilderness. I don't consider it wasted, Caleb said quietly. No? What do you call it then? You're one of the most innovative ranchers in the territory. Your breeding methods, your land management, people would pay a fortune to learn from you. But instead of sharing that knowledge and building an empire, you're here, alone. She paused delicately. Well, mostly alone. The implication was clear. Clara wasn't company. She was just staff. I'm not alone, Caleb said, and something in his voice made Victoria's smile falter. I have 40 men working this ranch year-round. I have Jack, who's been with me 15 years. I have Maggie, who keeps this house running. And I have Clara, who's rebuilt my entire accounting system and found thousands of dollars in billing errors I'd missed. How wonderful, Victoria said in a tone that suggested it was anything but, though surely that's what you pay her for. I pay her because she's worth paying, but she's here because she chose to be. There's a difference. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. I'm sure there is. She turned to Clara with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Tell me, Miss Bennett, how did you come to work for Caleb? It's such an unusual arrangement. A woman alone on a cattle ranch. Clara met her gaze steadily. I rode up during the winter storm. Caleb was kind enough to let me shelter here until the weather cleared. How fortunate. And then you just stayed? He offered me a position. I accepted. How practical. Though I imagine it must be difficult living so far from civilization. No society, no culture, no opportunities for someone of your... She paused, her eyes sweeping Clara's dress. Background. The word background landed like a slap. Victoria wasn't asking about Clara's past. She was implying Clara didn't have one worth mentioning. My background is surviving things that would have destroyed softer people, Clara said calmly. I consider that better preparation for life than any amount of society parties. Caleb made a sound that might have been a laugh disguised as a cough. Victoria's smile went sharp. How admirably resilient. Though I do hope you're not too comfortable here. Caleb's situation is rather temporary. Is it? Caleb's voice had gone cold. Well, naturally, you can't mean to stay out here forever. You're, 36? Eventually you'll want to settle somewhere civilized, build a real life. Perhaps even marry, though, of course that would require proximity to suitable women. Another pointed glance at Clara. The kind of woman who could match your status and help you build something significant. Clara felt the barb but refused to react. She'd survived 7 years of Tom's cruelty. Victoria's polished insults were nothing in comparison. But Caleb had gone very still in the way he did before violence, and Clara suddenly understood that Victoria had miscalculated badly. Let me be very clear, Caleb said, his voice quiet and absolutely deadly. This ranch is not temporary. This life is not a phase. I'm not hiding from civilization. I'm choosing something better. And if you came here thinking you could convince me otherwise by insulting the people I care about, you wasted your trip. I wasn't insulting. Yes, you were. You've spent this entire meal condescending to Clara because she's not wealthy or connected or polished. You've implied she's not good enough to sit at this table. You've suggested I'm somehow failing by building a life that doesn't revolve around impressing people like you. He set his napkin on the table with deliberate precision. I rejected 20 brides because they all wanted to change me into someone more acceptable. You're doing the same thing, just with different motivations. The answer is the same. No, Sig. Victoria's composure cracked. I'm trying to help you, Caleb. I've been trying to help you for years, but you're so stubborn, so determined to prove something. I'm not proving anything. I'm living my life, the life I chose, the life I want. He stood. Dinner is finished. Jack will drive you to town in the morning. There's a hotel. You'll be more comfortable there. You're throwing me out? I'm ending an unpleasant evening before it gets worse. You're welcome to stay the night in the guest room, but tomorrow you leave. Victoria stood, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. You'll regret this. When you're 50 and still alone in these mountains, you'll wish you'd listened to me. Maybe, but it'll be my regret, not yours. Good night, Victoria. She left in a rustle of expensive fabric and wounded pride, her footsteps sharp on the stairs. Caleb remained standing, his hands braced on the table, breathing carefully. Clara stood too, uncertain. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause... Don't. His voice was rough. Don't apologize for her being awful. Don't apologize for sitting at my table. Don't apologize for existing in my life. I just thought, you thought she was right, that you don't belong here, that I'm too good for you, or you're not good enough for me, or some other variation on the same poison. He finally looked at her, his eyes burning. She's wrong. About everything. You belong here more than she ever could. You fit here. You make this house feel like something other than a fortress. And if she can't see that, then she's even more blind than I thought. His throat felt tight. Caleb, I meant what I said. About caring about you being here because you chose to be. None of that was for show. He moved around the table toward her, his movements careful like he was approaching something fragile. I know I'm terrible at this, at saying what I mean, at showing people they matter, but you matter, Clara. You've mattered since the day you rode up here in a storm and called me terrified. You matter now, and Victoria can go back to San Francisco and her society parties and her opinions about how I should live, because none of it changes the fact that I want you here. They stood close enough that Clara could see the exhaustion in his face, the way his hands were clenched like he was fighting the urge to reach for her, the raw honesty in his eyes that probably cost him everything to show. I want to be here, she said quietly, not because I have nowhere else to go, because this feels like home. You feel like home, and I know that's complicated and probably too much too fast, but I'm done pretending I don't care about you just because caring is scary. It's terrifying, he agreed. Then we're both terrified. Seems like. They stood there in the dining room while Maggie made strategic noises in the kitchen and the house settled around them, and Caleb finally did what he'd been wanting to do since Clara had walked into dinner wearing a mended dress and carrying herself like a queen. He kissed her. It wasn't smooth or practiced or anything like the kisses in novels. It was awkward and hesitant and tasted like soup and felt like jumping off a cliff while hoping the ground would catch you. But it was real. It was honest. It was two broken people deciding that maybe, possibly, they were brave enough to try being whole together. When they finally pulled apart, Caleb looked stunned, like he'd surprised himself. That was, he started. Terrible, Clara finished. Absolutely terrible. Want to try again? Yes. The second kiss was better. Still not perfect, still clumsy in places, but better. Maggie appeared in the doorway, took one look at them, and smiled. About damn time. Now get out of my dining room. I have dishes to clear. They left, still standing too close, neither quite willing to let go of whatever they'd just started. Upstairs, Victoria Harrison packed her bags with sharp, angry movements and made plans to tell everyone in San Francisco that Caleb Mercer had completely lost his mind to some nobody from nowhere, and that his ranch would fail within the year because he was too stubborn to accept good advice. She would be wrong, but she'd believe it anyway, because people like Victoria couldn't understand that sometimes the best life wasn't the biggest or the most profitable or the most socially acceptable. Sometimes the best life was just the most honest. The next morning, Victoria left before breakfast without saying goodbye, and Caleb didn't pretend to be sorry. He watched her carriage disappear down the valley road while drinking coffee on the front porch, Clara standing beside him wrapped in a shawl against the early morning chill. Do you think she'll actually tell everyone you've lost your mind? Clara asked. Probably. Victoria's not good at accepting no. Will it hurt your business? No. The people who matter already know I'm difficult and stubborn and refuse to do things the conventional way. Victoria's opinion won't change that. He glanced at her. You okay? Why wouldn't I be? She was cruel to you, deliberately cruel. I've survived worse than Victoria Harrison's opinions about my dress. Clara sipped her own coffee. Though I'll admit, for a minute there, I wondered if she was right, if I was fooling myself thinking I belonged here. And now? Now I know she was wrong, because belonging isn't about wearing the right dress or knowing the right people. It's about mattering, and I matter here. Caleb set down his coffee cup and took her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses on her palm. You matter everywhere, but especially here. They stood on that porch watching the sun turn the mountains gold, holding hands like awkward teenagers who'd just discovered feelings were allowed. And somewhere in the valley, Clara's garden was growing and the cattle were thriving and the ranch that had been a fortress was slowly becoming a home. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. They'd still fight, still hurt each other, still struggle with fear and honesty and all the complicated things that came with caring about someone. But they'd do it together. And that made all the difference. The weeks after Victoria's departure settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Caleb worked the ranch with his usual intensity, but he started coming back to the house earlier, eating dinner at reasonable hours, even laughing occasionally when Clara made sarcastic observations about his organizational methods. Clara expanded her garden, adding more vegetables and a whole section of wildflowers that served no practical purpose except making her happy. She took over more of the ranch's administrative work, freeing Caleb to focus on the cattle and land management he actually enjoyed. And sometimes, in the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and talk about nothing important until the stars came out. They didn't rush anything, didn't push for declarations or definitions or any of the things that usually came with courtship. They just existed together, learning how to be close without walls, how to be honest without fear. But Montana had other plans. In late June, during a routine inspection of the northern fence line, Caleb's horse stepped in a hole hidden by tall grass and went down hard. Caleb had just enough time to kick free of the stirrups before 1,200 pounds of panicked horse rolled over the space where his leg had been seconds before. He landed badly, heard something in his shoulder crack, and tasted blood from where he'd bitten his tongue. Jack found him 20 minutes later, conscious but gray with pain, his left arm hanging at an angle that made Jack swear. "Don't move," Jack ordered, already pulling off his coat to make a sling. "I'm getting you back to the house. The horse is fine. Ran off. I'll find her later. You're not fine. Now shut up and let me help you." Getting Caleb onto Jack's horse was an exercise in pain management and creative swearing. Getting him back to the ranch took another 30 minutes of slow, careful riding that made Caleb's vision blur at the edges. Clara was working in her garden when they rode up. She looked up, saw Caleb's ashen face and the way he was holding his arm, and dropped her watering can. "What happened?" "Horse went down," Jack said, already dismounting. "Shoulders dislocated or broken, maybe both. Need to get the doc from town." Clara helped them get Caleb inside, ignoring his protests that he was fine, ignoring the way his hands were shaking from pain, ignoring everything except getting him settled in a chair where Maggie could assess the damage. Maggie took one look at Caleb's shoulder and shook her head. "That's bad. Real bad. Could be dislocated, could be separated, could be broken. Either way, it needs a doctor." "Town's 3 hours round trip," Jack said. "I can go." "I'll go," Clara interrupted. "You're needed here. I can ride fast enough." "Clara, Caleb started, his voice thin with pain. "Don't argue. You're hurt. You need a doctor. I'm getting one." She was already moving toward the door, already planning the route to town, already pushing aside the fear that Caleb might be seriously injured because fear wouldn't help him. She made it to Watershed in just over an hour, riding one of the fastest horses on the ranch like her life depended on it, and found the doctor finishing lunch at the hotel restaurant. Doc Morrison was 70 if he was a day, but his hands were steady and his mind sharp, and he didn't waste time asking questions. Just grabbed his bag, followed Clara to his wagon, and started the journey back to the ranch. "How bad is it?" he asked as they rode. "His shoulder's wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. Like it's sitting in the wrong place." "Dislocated, probably. Maybe separated. Won't know until I see it. He conscious?" "He was when I left. In pain, but conscious." "Good. That's good." They made it back to the ranch in record time. Clara burst through the front door to find Caleb exactly where she'd left him, pale and sweating, with Maggie hovering nearby and Jack pacing like a caged animal. Doc Morrison took one look at Caleb's shoulder, prodded it gently while Caleb tried not to pass out, and nodded. "Dislocated. Severe one. I can put it back in, but it's going to hurt like hell." "Just do it," Caleb said through clenched teeth. "Need someone to hold you steady. You're going to want to move. Can't have that." Jack moved forward. "I've got him." What followed was one of the worst things Clara had ever witnessed. Jack held Caleb's good side while Doc Morrison manipulated the dislocated shoulder, and the sound Caleb made when it popped back into place was something Clara would hear in her nightmares. Then it was done. Caleb slumped in the chair, breathing hard, his face slick with sweat, but some of the color returning. "That's the worst of it," Doc Morrison said, fashioning a sling from clean cloth. "Shoulder's back where it belongs, but you tore ligaments doing it. Maybe damaged the rotator cuff. You're going to be in this sling for at least 6 weeks. No heavy lifting, no riding, no working cattle, nothing that stresses that shoulder or you'll do permanent damage." 6 weeks? Caleb looked at the doctor like he'd suggested 6 years. "I can't not work for 6 weeks." "You can and you will, unless you want a shoulder that never works right again. I have a ranch to run. Then you'll run it one-handed for a while, or you'll let other people help." Doc Morrison snapped his bag shut. "I mean it, Mercer. You push too hard too fast, you'll cripple yourself. I've seen it happen. Men like you who think they're invincible, who think work is more important than healing, they end up with arms that don't lift right and pain that never goes away. That what you want? Caleb looked mutinous but said nothing. Clara stepped forward. He'll follow your orders, doctor. I'll make sure of it. Good luck with that. Stubborn doesn't begin to cover it with this one. But Doc Morrison looked relieved. I'll check back in a week. Meanwhile, keep that arm immobilized. Ice for the swelling, whiskey for the pain, and rest. Actually rest, not sit in my study doing paperwork, rest. He left, promising to send the bill, and the house fell into tense silence. Caleb sat in that chair with his arm in a sling, looking like someone had stolen something essential from him. 6 weeks. Could have been worse, Jack said. Could have been your neck. 6 weeks of not working. 6 weeks of being useless while everyone else does my job. You're not useless, Clara said firmly. You're injured. There's a difference. Not to me, there isn't. She understood then. Understood that for Caleb, work wasn't just something he did. It was how he measured his worth, how he proved he mattered, how he justified taking up space in the world. Taking that away from him, even temporarily, even for good reasons, was taking away his identity. We need to talk, she said quietly. Everyone else, out. Maggie and Jack exchanged looks but left, closing the door behind them. Clara pulled a chair close to Caleb's and sat. You're terrified. I'm annoyed. You're terrified that if you can't work, you don't matter. That if you're not constantly proving your worth through labor, people will realize you're not actually valuable. His jaw tightened. Don't psychoanalyze me. I'm not psychoanalyzing. I'm calling you on your bullshit. You think the only reason anyone stays is because you're useful, because you provide something. Take that away and you're convinced everyone will leave. That's not... Yes, it is. It's exactly what you think. Because Rachel left when you were still building, when you weren't established enough or wealthy enough or successful enough. So you spent 13 years making yourself into someone so competent, so capable, so useful that nobody would ever have a reason to leave again. Clara leaned forward. But you're wrong. Because I'm not staying because you're useful. I'm staying because you're you. Injured shoulder and all. You say that now. Isiu? I'll say it 6 weeks from now, too. I'll say it 6 months from now. I'll say it for as long as it takes for you to believe that you matter, regardless of what you can do for other people. She took his good hand. You have value, Caleb. Not because you run a successful ranch, or because you're wealthy, or because you can work 18-hour days. You have value because you're a person, a difficult, stubborn, occasionally infuriating person, but a person who deserves rest and healing and care. He stared at their joined hands. I don't know how to not work. Then learn. For 6 weeks, learn how to let other people help. Learn how to accept that sometimes you're the one who needs taking care of instead of always being the one who provides. Learn that being human means being vulnerable sometimes. I hate this. I know. I'm going to be terrible at it. I'm counting on it. He almost smiled. Almost. You're not going to let me work, are you? Not a chance. Doc Morrison gave orders. I'm enforcing them. You realize I'm your employer. I can fire you. Try it. See what happens. They sat in that room while afternoon light painted everything gold, and Caleb made the hardest decision of his adult life. To surrender control and trust that people would stay even when he couldn't prove his worth through constant productivity. Okay, he said finally. 6 weeks, but I'm doing paperwork that doesn't stress the shoulder. Light paperwork, and only if you rest between sessions. You're going to be insufferable about this, aren't you? Absolutely. Fine. Clara stood, still holding his hand. Come on. Maggie's probably making soup whether you want it or not. You should eat. I'm not hungry. Don't care. You're eating. Doctor's orders included proper nutrition. That's not what he said. Close enough. She helped him stand, careful of his injured shoulder, and guided him toward the kitchen where Maggie was indeed making soup, and Jack was pretending he hadn't been listening at the door. The next 6 weeks tested everyone's patience. Caleb was a terrible patient. He tried to work when he thought no one was watching. He attempted to check on cattle one-handed until Jack threatened to tie him to a chair. He complained about being useless until Clara started charging him $1 for every complaint, which shut him up faster than any amount of logic. But slowly, something shifted. Forced to sit still, Caleb started actually seeing his ranch instead of just managing it. He noticed Clara's garden had grown from a small plot to something substantial. Noticed Maggie had reorganized the kitchen for better efficiency. Noticed Jack had implemented a new rotation system for the grazing that was working even better than Caleb's original plan. He also noticed Clara, really noticed her. The way she moved through the house like she belonged there. The way she hummed while working in her garden. The way she'd bring him coffee in the mornings without being asked, sitting with him while he worked through light paperwork, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. The way she'd become essential without him realizing it was happening. One evening in late July, with his shoulder healing but still weak, Caleb found Clara in her garden pulling weeds in the fading light. "It's getting dark," he said. "I know, almost finished." "You've been out here for 3 hours." "The weeds don't care about my schedule." He sat on the edge of the garden bed, watching her work with the same focused intensity she applied to everything. "Thank you." "For what?" "For the last 6 weeks. For forcing me to rest. For taking over the administrative work. For keeping me from doing something stupid that would have crippled me permanently." Clara sat back on her heels, dirt on her hands, and satisfaction on her face. "You're welcome, though you made it as difficult as possible." "I excel at difficult." "I've noticed." They sat in her garden while fireflies started their evening dance and the mountains turned purple with sunset, and Caleb made another decision. "Move into the main bedroom," he said. Clara went still. "What?" "Your room is too small. The main bedroom is bigger, gets better light, has its own sitting area. You should have it." "That's your room." "It's too big for one person. And—" He hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "And I want you there. Not in the guest wing like you're temporary. In the main house, where you belong." "Caleb, I'm not asking you to marry me. Not yet. I'm just asking you to stop pretending you're only here temporarily. You're not temporary, Clara. You haven't been since the day you reorganized my study and called me scared." Clara's throat felt tight. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything. Your shoulder's still healing. This might be the pain medication talking." "I haven't taken pain medication in 3 weeks. This is me, clear-headed and certain, asking you to move into the main bedroom because I'm tired of pretending I don't want you as close as possible." She looked at him, this man who'd spent 13 years building walls, who was now deliberately tearing them down, who was offering her space in his life instead of just his house, and felt something settle into place that had been searching for home her entire life. "Okay," she said. "I'll move into the main bedroom." "Yeah?" "Yeah." They smiled at each other like idiots, covered in dirt and healing injuries and all the messy reality of actual life. And in that moment, everything was exactly as complicated and perfect as it needed to be. Clara moved her things that weekend. It wasn't much. She'd arrived with almost nothing and hadn't accumulated much since. But watching her dresses hang in the wardrobe next to Caleb's shirts, seeing her books on the shelf beside his ledgers, noticing her brush on the vanity, transformed the room from his space into their space. Caleb stood in the doorway watching her arrange things and felt something he hadn't felt since before Rachel. Contentment. Real contentment. Not the lie he'd told himself for 13 years, but the genuine feeling of rightness that came from building something with someone instead of alone. "Stop watching me," Claire said without turning around. "It's creepy." "I'm observing. You're staring like a man who just realized he accidentally fell in love and doesn't know what to do about it." The words hung in the air. Caleb's chest went tight. Clara turned to face him, her expression careful. "Did I just—" "Yes." "I didn't mean to say it like that." "Is it true?" She could have lied, could have backed away from what she'd accidentally revealed, could have made it easier for both of them by pretending it was a joke. But Clara had spent 7 years lying to make Tom comfortable. She was done lying. "Yes," she said simply. "It's true. I love you. I didn't mean to. Wasn't planning to. But somewhere between you fixing my window in a blizzard and you forcing yourself to rest because I asked, I fell in love with you. And if that's too much too fast, I understand. But I'm done pretending I don't feel things just because feeling them is inconvenient." Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides, pulled her close with his good arm, and kissed her like she was air and he'd been drowning. "I love you too," he said against her mouth. "I probably have since you called me terrified. I definitely have since you reorganized my study. And I absolutely have since you spent 6 weeks forcing me to be human instead of just functional." "We're both disasters," Clara said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Complete disasters." "This is going to be complicated." "Probably. We're going to hurt each other sometimes." "Definitely." "I love you anyway." "I love you anyway, too." They stood in that bedroom holding each other while the Montana summer painted everything gold. Two broken people who decided being broken together was better than being whole alone, and somewhere in the valley, Clara's garden was blooming and the ranch was thriving, and the fortress had finally, completely become a home. August arrived with heat that turned the valley gold in afternoons so bright they hurt to look at. Caleb's shoulder had healed enough for light work, though Doc Morrison still threatened violence if he pushed too hard, and the ranch settled into rhythms that felt less like survival and more like actual living. But nothing worth having came without being tested. The test arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of a telegram delivered by a boy from Watershed who'd ridden out specifically to bring it. Caleb read it twice, his face going carefully blank in the way Clara had learned meant he was processing something difficult. "What is it?" she asked, looking up from the breakfast table where she'd been reviewing supply orders. "Rachel's husband died. Heart attack, apparently. She's back in Watershed, staying at the hotel." He set the telegram down with precise movements. "She wants to see me." The kitchen went very quiet. Even Maggie stopped moving, her hands still on the bread dough she was kneading. Clara felt ice form in her stomach. "Are you going?" "I don't know. Should I?" "That's not my decision to make." "I'm asking your opinion anyway." Clara thought about the woman who'd broken Caleb 13 years ago, who taught him that love was temporary and trust was stupid. Thought about how much work it had taken to convince him otherwise. Thought about how fragile new love was, how easily old wounds could reopen. "I think," she said carefully, "that you need to decide what you want from that meeting. Do you want closure, answers, or are you hoping for something else?" "I don't know what I want. I thought I was done with Rachel. Thought I'd put all that behind me. But seeing her name on that telegram..." He ran his good hand through his hair. "I felt something. Not love. Not anymore. But something." "Then maybe you should go. Figure out what that something is. You're not worried I'll ikal." "What? Fall back in love with her? Run off to San Francisco?" Clara stood, walked to where he sat, and put her hands on his shoulders. "No, I'm not worried about that. Because you're not the same man Rachel left. You've changed. We've changed you. And whatever you felt reading that telegram, it's not the same thing you felt 13 years ago." Caleb covered one of her hands with his. "You're very certain. I'm certain that you loved me. I'm certain that you've built a life here that matters. I'm certain that Rachel Thornton is part of your past, not your future." She squeezed his shoulder gently. "But I also think you need to see her. Not for her sake. For yours. So you can close that chapter completely instead of wondering what if for the rest of your life. And if seeing her changes things, then we'll deal with it, together, like we deal with everything else." He pulled her into his lap, careful of his healing shoulder, and held her close. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not. I'm exceptional." She kissed his forehead. "Go see Rachel. Get your answers. Come home. We'll be here." Caleb rode into Watershed that afternoon, his shoulder aching from the movement but functional, his mind a mess of emotions he couldn't quite name. Part of him wanted to turn around. Part of him needed to see this through. All of him missed Clara already, which was ridiculous considering he'd only been gone 2 hours. The hotel was the same building where he'd found Rachel packing 13 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. She was waiting in the small parlor off the lobby, dressed in black morning clothes that made her look older than 36. Still beautiful, but with lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and a weariness in her posture that suggested her wealthy life hadn't been as perfect as she'd hoped. "Caleb?" She stood when he entered, her hands clasped in front of her. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either." He stayed near the door, maintaining distance. "I'm sorry about your husband." "Are you? You never met him." "I'm sorry you lost someone, even if I didn't know him." Rachel smiled sadly. "Still kind, even after everything." "What do you want, Rachel?" Blunt as ever. She gestured to the chairs. "Will you sit? Please?" He sat, but stayed tense, ready to leave at any moment. Rachel took the chair across from him, her hands still clasped like she was physically holding herself together. "I heard you've been rejecting marriage proposals. 20 women, they say. Is it true?" "Was true, not anymore." "Oh?" Something flickered across her face. "You've finally chosen someone." "She chose me, actually. Made it very clear she was staying whether I liked it or not." "She sounds formidable." "She is." Rachel was quiet for a moment. studying him with eyes that had once made him stupid with wanting. You look different, happier maybe, or at least less angry. I was never angry at you, Rachel. I was angry at myself for believing you meant the promises you made. I did mean them, at the time, but not enough to keep them. No. She looked down at her hands. Not enough for that. I was young and scared, and I wanted security more than I wanted love. That was my choice. My mistake. Why am I here, Rachel? What do you want? She took a breath like she was bracing herself. I want to apologize, properly apologize, for leaving the way I did, for choosing money over you, for spending 13 years convincing myself I made the right choice when I knew, deep down, that I destroyed something real for something convenient. Caleb stared at her, trying to feel something beyond mild surprise. You came all the way back to Montana to apologize? I came back because my husband died and I realized I'd wasted 13 years being comfortable instead of happy. I came back because I heard about you rejecting all those women and I wondered if maybe, possibly, you were waiting for me. She met his eyes. But you're not, are you? You found someone else, someone who makes you look the way you're looking right now, peaceful instead of defensive. Her name is Clara. She showed up during a winter storm with nothing but honesty and stubbornness, and she's been systematically destroying every wall I built since you left. I love her. I'm going to marry her if she'll have me, and no apology, however genuine, changes that. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. I'm glad. Truly, you deserve to be happy. So do you. I'm not sure I know how anymore. She wiped her eyes carefully. My husband was kind but distant. I had everything I thought I wanted, money, status, security, and none of it mattered because I spent 13 years wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Did you? Yes. But it's too late to fix it. You've moved on. She gestured vaguely. I've made my choices. Now I get to live with them. Caleb felt something release in his chest, something he hadn't known he was still carrying. I forgive you. Rachel looked startled. What? I forgive you for leaving, for choosing security over me, for all of it. You made the choice that felt right at the time. I can't fault you for that, and holding on to anger about it has only hurt me, not you. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. Probably not, but I'm giving it anyway. Because staying angry takes energy I'd rather spend on building a life with Clara. They sat in that parlor while afternoon light painted the dusty furniture gold, and Rachel Thornton finally cried for the life she'd chosen and the one she'd lost, while Caleb Mercer felt the last chains of his past fall away. I hope she makes you happy, Rachel said finally. She makes me human. That's better than happy. Will you invite me to the wedding? No. But I hope you find someone who makes you human too. He left her there, crying quietly in morning black, and rode back to the ranch feeling lighter than he had in 13 years. Claire was in her garden when he returned, pulling weeds in the evening light, like she hadn't spent all day wondering if he'd come back or stay in town with the ghost of his past. She looked up when his horse approached, her expression carefully neutral. How was it? Exactly what I needed. He dismounted, tied his horse, and walked into the garden, dirt and all. She apologized. I forgave her. We both acknowledged that we made choices we have to live with, and then I came home. Just like that? Just like that. He pulled her up from the dirt, kissed her thoroughly, and smiled against her mouth. She asked if I'd invite her to our wedding. Clara pulled back. Our what? Wedding. You know, the thing where two people stand in front of witnesses and promise to be disasters together for the foreseeable future. Are you proposing? I'm mentioning the possibility of proposing. Thought I'd check if you'd say yes before I made it official. That's the least romantic proposal mention I've ever heard. Good thing I'm not actually proposing yet, then. Clara laughed, actually laughed, her hands covered in dirt and her heart full of this impossible man who'd somehow become everything she needed. When you do actually propose, it better be better than this. I'll take it under advisement. He kissed her again. I love you. I'm going to marry you. Rachel Thornton is firmly in my past. And your tomatoes are getting eaten by something, probably rabbits. Romantic and practical, you spoil me. I try. They stood in her garden while the sun set over the mountains and the ranch settled into evening rhythms, two people who'd survived their pasts and chosen their futures, and Caleb made a mental note to plan an actual proposal that didn't involve mentioning his ex-wife, and garden pests. He managed it in September. Clara's garden had exploded into abundance by then. Tomatoes and beans and squash and enough herbs to stock Maggie's kitchen for a year. She spent every evening there, harvesting and planning for next year and talking to the plants like they were friends. Caleb found her there on an evening when autumn was just starting to edge the leaves with gold, surrounded by vegetables and wildflowers, and all the proof that broken people could grow beautiful things if given time and space. "Clara," he said, and something in his voice made her look up immediately. He was standing at the edge of her garden holding something small in his hand, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. That's the problem." He took a breath. "I rehearsed this, had a whole speech planned, but now I'm here, and you're covered in dirt and you're looking at me like I'm about to tell you something terrible, and I can't remember any of it. Caleb, I love you. I've loved you since you rode up here in a storm and refused to leave. I love that you reorganize my study without asking. I love that you force me to rest when I'm injured. I love that you plant flowers that serve no purpose except being beautiful. I love that you see me, actually see me, and choose to stay anyway." He opened his hand, revealing a ring, simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the evening light. "This was my grandmother's. Only thing my mother left me when she died. I've been carrying it around for 3 days trying to figure out the right way to do this, and I finally realized there is no right way. There's just honest." He took a step closer. "Marry me, Clara. Not because it's practical or convenient or makes sense. Marry me because we're better together than apart. Because I want to spend the rest of my life building something real with you. Because you make me human, and I want to keep being human for as long as I'm alive." Clara's hands were shaking. "That's the worst proposal I've ever heard." "It's the only proposal you've ever heard." "Still the worst." "Is that a no?" "It's a yes, you idiot. It's absolutely a yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along, and pulled her close, kissing her like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning, tasting dirt and tomatoes and forever. "We're getting married," he said against her mouth. "Apparently. You're going to be Clara Mercer. I'm keeping Bennett too, Clara Bennett Mercer. That way I don't lose myself completely." "Fair enough, Clara Bennett Mercer it is." They stood in her garden while the Montana sky turned orange and pink and finally purple. Two people who'd been broken in different ways by different people, who'd chosen to build something new instead of staying ruined. And somewhere in the valley, the cattle lowed and the ranch hands finished their work, and the house that had been a fortress waited to become a home in all the ways that mattered. They were married in October under trees that had turned gold and red and orange, with half the valley in attendance because Caleb Mercer getting married was news worth witnessing. Jack stood as best man, looking uncomfortable in a suit. Maggie cried through the entire ceremony despite claiming she never cried. The ranch hands cleaned up surprisingly well and behaved mostly appropriately, and Clara wore a dress that Maggie had helped her make from fabric ordered from Denver. Simple white cotton with lace at the collar and sleeves, nothing like the expensive gowns the previous brides had worn, but perfect for a woman who valued substance over show. Caleb wore his best suit and looked terrified right up until Clara started walking toward him, and then he just looked like a man who couldn't believe his luck. The vows were traditional because neither of them trusted themselves to write their own without getting too honest and making everyone uncomfortable. But when the minister said, "You may kiss the bride," Caleb kissed Clara like they were alone instead of surrounded by witnesses, and someone in the back, probably one of the younger ranch hands, whistled inappropriately. The reception was held at the ranch house, which had been transformed by Maggie's organizational genius and the combined efforts of everyone who'd decided Caleb Mercer deserved happiness after 13 years of self-imposed isolation. There was food and music and dancing that neither Caleb nor Clara were particularly good at, but attempted anyway, because marriage was about trying things even when you were terrible at them. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone and the remaining few were too drunk to notice, Clara found Caleb standing on the front porch looking at the mountains. "Hiding from your own wedding?" she asked, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the October chill. "Observing my own wedding. There's a difference." "You looked terrified during the vows." "I was terrified. Still am, actually." "Of what?" "Screwing this up, hurting you, proving that I'm still too damaged to build something good." He pulled her close, his arms around her waist. "I've spent 13 years convinced I was better off alone. Now I'm married to you, and I'm terrified I'll forget how to be a husband instead of just a fortress." Clara leaned into him, her back against his chest, looking at the same mountains he was looking at. You know what I'm terrified of? What? Being happy. Actually, genuinely happy. Because every time I was happy with Tom, something bad happened. Like happiness was permission for the universe to hurt me. So part of me keeps waiting for this to fall apart, keeps expecting you to change or leave or turn into someone cruel. I'm not going to do any of those things. I know. Logically, I know. But fear isn't logical. They stood on that porch, married less than 6 hours, already being honest about the fears that would probably follow them forever. And Caleb realized this was what marriage actually was. Not perfection, not smooth sailing, just two people choosing each other despite the fear, despite the damage, despite all the reasons they could use to run away. We're going to be terrible at this sometimes, he said. Probably. We'll fight. We'll hurt each other. We'll have days where we can't stand each other. And we'll work through it anyway. We'll work through it anyway. They went inside together as the last guests were leaving, thanking everyone for coming, accepting congratulations and well wishes, and finally closing the door on a day that had transformed them from two individuals into something larger. The house was a disaster. The kitchen looked like a battlefield. There were dishes everywhere and flowers wilting on tables and evidence of celebration in every corner. We should clean, Clara said without conviction. We should go to bed, Caleb countered. Maggie will murder us if we leave this mess. Maggie's already gone home. We'll deal with it tomorrow. That's irresponsible. I'm feeling irresponsible. He swept her up, carefully, because his shoulder was healed but not invincible, and carried her toward the stairs while she laughed and protested that this was ridiculous and romantic, and exactly what she'd needed without knowing she needed it. Their bedroom had been transformed too. Someone, probably Maggie, had put flowers everywhere and laid out Clara's nightgown and left candles burning that created shadows and warmth. Caleb set Clara down gently, suddenly awkward in a way he hadn't been since they'd first kissed. I know we've been sharing a bed for months, but this feels different. Because we're married now. It's official. And terrifying. And wonderful. And terrifying. Clara took his face in her hands. I love you. You love me. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. That's the deal. That's a terrible deal. It's the only deal I'm offering. He kissed her then, slow and careful, and they forgot about the mess downstairs and the candles burning and anything except each other, two broken people who'd decided being whole together was better than being fragments alone. The first year of marriage taught them things no amount of courtship could have prepared them for. They learned that Caleb was grumpy in the mornings, and Clara was chatty, and they had to negotiate breakfast conversation levels. They learned that Clara hated when Caleb tracked mud through her clean kitchen, and Caleb hated when Clara reorganized his things without telling him where they'd gone. They had their first real fight in December over something stupid, whether to buy new breeding stock or reinvest in infrastructure, and said things they regretted and spent 2 days being coldly polite before finally sitting down and actually talking it through. They learned that marriage wasn't about never fighting. It was about fighting fair and choosing forgiveness, and remembering that you were on the same side even when it felt like opposition. They learned that some days were hard for no reason, that sometimes Caleb would wake up feeling like he'd failed at everything, and sometimes Clara would spend entire afternoons convinced she didn't deserve happiness. And they learned to recognize those days and hold space for each other instead of trying to fix what couldn't be fixed with words. They also learned joy. Clara's garden expanded every year, becoming something the whole valley talked about. Caleb's ranch continued thriving, his methods getting attention from ranchers across the territory. They hired a young woman from town to help with bookkeeping when Clara's workload got too heavy, and she fit into their household like she'd always been there. On their first anniversary, Caleb found Clara in her garden, where else, and sat on the edge of the bed she was weeding. 1 year, he said. 1 year of you being insufferable and me being stubborn. Best year of my life. Mine too. They sat in comfortable silence while autumn painted the world gold again, and Clara thought about the woman she'd been a year and a half ago. Broken, empty, convinced she was meant to disappear quietly. And she thought about who she'd become, strong, seen, building a life that mattered. Do you ever regret it? Caleb asked suddenly. Riding up here in that storm? Staying when you could have left? Not once. Do you regret letting me in? Every day. She smacked his arm. Liar. You're right, I don't regret it, but I do still get scared sometimes that you'll wake up one day and realize you could have had someone easier, someone less damaged. I don't want easier. I want real, and you're the most real thing I've ever had. He pulled her close, dirt and all, and held her like she was precious. I love you. I love you too. They stayed like that until the sun started setting, until Maggie called them for dinner, until life interrupted in all the best ways. The second year brought new challenges. Clara got pregnant in the spring, which neither of them had planned, but both wanted desperately once they knew. The pregnancy was difficult. Clara was sick for months, exhausted and miserable, snapping at Caleb when he hovered and crying when he didn't. Caleb was terrified. Terrified something would go wrong. Terrified he'd be a terrible father. Terrified that this fragile happiness they'd built could be destroyed by loss. But their daughter was born in January during another winter storm, healthy and screaming and perfect in all the ways that mattered. They named her Margaret, after Maggie, though they called her Maggie Jr. until the baby was old enough to protest. Watching Caleb hold his daughter for the first time, seeing this hard man turn soft and careful around something so small and breakable, Clara understood that healing wasn't linear. It wasn't something you achieved and then maintained forever. It was something you worked at daily, choosing growth over safety, choosing vulnerability over walls. Years passed. The ranch grew. Clara's garden became legendary. Maggie Jr. grew into a wild child who loved cattle and dirt and asking questions nobody could answer. They had a son 3 years later, then another daughter 2 years after that. The house that had been a fortress filled with noise and chaos and all the beautiful mess that came with actual living. Caleb never fully lost his need for control, but he learned to surrender to things bigger than himself: love, family, the messy reality of children who didn't follow plans. Clara never fully lost her fear of abandonment, but she learned to trust that Caleb's love was steady, that on the days when she felt small or invisible or too much, he'd remind her that she mattered, that she'd always mattered. They fought, they hurt each other, they had days where they didn't particularly like each other, but they'd made promises in front of witnesses, and more importantly, they'd made promises to themselves, to choose each other even when it was hard, to stay even when leaving looked easier, to build something real instead of something comfortable. On their 10th anniversary, they stood in Clara's garden, massively expanded now, with sections managed by their oldest daughter who'd inherited her mother's love of growing things, and looked at everything they'd built. 10 years, Caleb said, his arm around Clara's waist. You tired of me yet? Exhausted. But I'm stuck with you now. Divorce is too much paperwork. Always practical. I learned from the best. Their children were playing near the barn under Jack's supervision, their voices carrying across the evening air. The ranch hands were finishing their work. Maggie was making dinner inside, and everything was imperfect and complicated and exactly right. I'm glad you rode up here in that storm, Caleb said quietly. I'm glad you were stubborn enough to stay. I'm glad you saw through all my walls and decided I was worth the effort. I'm glad you let me in. I'm glad you learned how to be human again. I'm glad we built this together. They stood in that garden they'd planted together, watching their children grow in the house they'd transformed together, and understood something that had taken 10 years to fully realize. Healing wasn't about becoming undamaged. It was about learning to build beautiful things despite the damage. It was about choosing life over survival, connection over safety, messy, imperfect love over comfortable isolation. The fortress had become a home. The broken people had become whole enough. And the ranch that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with laughter and arguments and all the sounds of people who'd chosen each other despite every reason not to. 20 years after Clara Bennett rode through a storm to reach Caleb Mercer's gate, she stood in a garden that had become an institution in the valley, watching her granddaughter, Maggie Jr.'s daughter, learn to plant tomatoes the same way she'd been taught. Caleb was older now, his hair more silver than dark, his body worn from decades of hard work, but still strong enough to ride and work alongside men half his age. He walked with a slight limp from an old injury, and his shoulders still ached when storms were coming, but he was alive and present and laughing more than he'd ever thought possible. The ranch had grown into one of the most successful operations in Montana, not because Caleb had focused solely on profit, but because he'd focused on building something sustainable, something that would last beyond him. Their children had grown and scattered and come back, building their own lives while staying connected to the land that had raised them. Maggie Jr. ran the breeding program now. Their son managed the business side. Their youngest daughter had become a veterinarian and returned to work with the herds. And through it all, Clara had been the steady center, managing, organizing, challenging, loving. Her garden had become a teaching space where valley children learned to grow food, Her house had become a gathering place where people came to celebrate and mourn and simply exist together. "You're thinking too hard," Caleb said, coming to stand beside her while their granddaughter dug in the dirt with intense concentration. "I'm thinking about how far we've come. How different everything is from that day I showed up here with nothing." "You didn't have nothing. You had stubbornness and honesty. Turns out that was enough." "It shouldn't have been. On paper, this should have been a disaster. Broken widow meets damaged rancher, both too scared to trust, both convinced they were better off alone. And yet here we are. 20 years, 3 children, more grandchildren than I can keep track of, and a garden that's become more famous than my cattle." Clara smiled. "Your cattle are very famous." "Not as famous as your tomatoes." "True." They stood watching their granddaughter plant seeds that would become food, and Clara thought about how much of life was exactly that, planting seeds without knowing exactly what they'd become, trusting the process, doing the work, hoping for growth. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come here?" Clara asked. "If I'd stayed in Watershed and tried to build a life there instead?" "Every day. And every day I'm grateful you were brave enough to ride into a storm looking for someone who understood loneliness." "I was terrified." "So was I. Might be the bravest thing either of us ever did, choosing each other despite the terror." Their granddaughter had finished planting and was now examining a worm with fascination, asking questions about whether worms had families and if they got lonely and whether they liked living in gardens. "She's got your curiosity," Caleb observed. "She's got your stubbornness. We're in trouble." "We've always been in trouble. We just call it love and pretend it's normal." Clara laughed, leaning into him, and felt the same certainty she'd felt 20 years ago in this same garden, that some things were worth the risk, that some people were worth fighting your own fear to reach, that broken didn't mean finished and damaged didn't mean worthless. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and orange, Clara Bennett Mercer stood in her garden with her husband and granddaughter and understood the truth she'd spent a lifetime learning. Strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about breaking and choosing to rebuild anyway. It was about taking shattered pieces and creating something new instead of trying to restore what was lost. The fortress had become a home. The broken people had become healers, and the woman who'd ridden through a storm convinced she'd lost herself had found something better. She'd found the strength to build a new self, piece by careful piece, in soil she'd prepared with her own scarred hands. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, passed down through generations who would never fully understand how much courage it had taken to start it. But maybe that was okay. Maybe every generation had to learn their own lessons about fear and love and choosing connection over safety. For now, there was dinner to make and children to gather and all the ordinary miracles of a life well lived. Caleb took Clara's hand as they walked back to the house, their granddaughter running ahead, and neither of them spoke because some things didn't need words. Some things just needed presence, commitment, and the daily choice to keep choosing each other. The Montana sky turned purple, and the first stars emerged, and the house that had once been empty filled with the sounds of family. And if you listened carefully, you could almost hear it. The echo of a woman riding through a storm toward a man who'd forgotten how to hope, both of them terrified, both of them brave, both of them choosing life over survival. That was the real story. Not a fairy tale about perfection, but an honest account of 2 damaged people who learned that healing wasn't about becoming undamaged. It was about learning to live fully, despite the scars, to love completely, despite the fear, to build courageously, despite knowing that everything built can eventually fall. They'd built anyway, and it had been enough, more than enough. It had been everything.